You are the universe's most elaborate magic trick, and you are the only one who can't see the wires. It's a humbling, almost offensive thought. There is no little person sitting in your skull pulling levers. There is no soul drifting behind your pupils. There is only biology, frantic, unthinking biology, that has perfected the art of pretending to be a person. Right now, as you settle into the quiet of this moment, your brain is spinning a fiction so seamless that you don't even recognize it as a fiction. It is fabricating the sensation of you, the weight of your limbs, the texture of the air, the subtle tension in your jaw. None of these sensations are real in the way a rock is real. They are interpretations, guesses made by cells that are profoundly deaf and blind to the world outside your skull. And yet, the story they tell is so convincing that you never question it. You simply lie there, whole in the dark. But here's the thing, that dark, that quiet, that seamless story of selfhood, it's not a given. It's not something humanity has always understood or even recognized as a puzzle to be solved. For most of our existence, we didn't have the foggiest idea that the brain had anything to do with any of it. Tonight we're going to go through all of consciousness, the whole strange, unresolved, genuinely mysterious subject of it, from the very beginning. We'll start with the earliest ideas people had about what a mind even was, thousands of years before anyone had a word for neuron, before anyone had drawn a diagram of a brain, before anyone understood that thought happened inside the head at all. People were already puzzling over the difference between a living body and a dead one, between a person awake and a person asleep, between the warm, breathing presence of someone you love and the still, cooling shape that remains after that presence has gone somewhere else. The question of what that presence was, and where it went, and whether it could exist apart from the body it once moved through, has been with us for as long as we've been burying our dead and telling stories about where they've gone. We'll move through the philosophers who first drew a hard line between mind and body, the thinkers who argued that the thinking self and the physical self are two entirely different kinds of thing, made of two entirely different kinds of stuff, obeying two entirely different sets of rules. We'll spend time with the scientists who tried, across centuries, to erase that line again, to show that mind is not a ghost riding inside a machine, but something the machine itself does, the way a heart pumps blood or a stomach digests food, a natural function of a natural organ, however strange and hard to pin down, that function turns out to be. We'll get into how the brain actually seems to build experience, moment by moment, the slow assembly of a world inside your head from millions of tiny, separate pieces of information, color processed in one place, motion in another, sound in yet another, and somehow all of it bound together into the single, seamless moment you're living right now, hearing these words, feeling this surface beneath you, without any visible seams at all. We'll talk about why that process is so hard to catch in the act, why the very thing that feels most immediate and most obvious to you, your own experience, right here, right now, turns out to be remarkably difficult to study from the outside. You can describe what you're feeling. You can report on the contents of your own mind, but the feeling itself, the raw fact of what it's like to be you, remains stubbornly private, locked inside a skull no one else can see into directly. We'll talk about dreams, those strange, vivid, entirely convincing worlds your brain builds every night while your body lies still, worlds that feel completely real while you're inside them, complete with their own logic, their own geography, their own cast of characters, all of it generated by the same machinery that's generating this quiet moment of listening right now, just running with the input turned down and the internal prediction turned up. We'll talk about anesthesia, that carefully controlled, temporary erasure of the self that millions of people undergo every year. The odd fact that a small amount of a specific chemical introduced into the bloodstream can cause the entire felt world to simply stop, and then, a few hours later, to start up again, apparently none the worse for the interruption, as though someone had switched off a light and then switched it back on, with the same person waking up who fell asleep, the same memories intact, the same sense of a continuous self somehow surviving a gap of nothingness in the middle. We'll talk about animals, about the growing, careful, evidence-based recognition that a great many other creatures on this planet almost certainly have some form of felt experience of their own, that the inner light is not a strictly human possession, but seems to arise, in varying degrees and varying qualities, across a much wider swath of the living world than we were comfortable acknowledging for a very long time. And we'll talk about the unsettled, increasingly urgent question of whether a machine could ever have an inner life the way you do, whether a system built from silicon and code rather than neurons and blood could ever genuinely experience anything at all, or whether it would forever be, however impressive its conversation, a kind of very sophisticated echo, producing all the right words with no one home behind them to hear what the words mean. By the end of tonight, you won't have all the answers, because nobody does. There is no book you can read, no paper you can download, no lecture you can attend that will lay out the full, finished, settled explanation of what consciousness is and how it works. The deepest parts of this question remain genuinely open, actively debated by serious people who have devoted their entire careers to studying them. But you'll understand why the questions are so hard. You'll understand what makes this particular problem different from other scientific problems, why explaining how the brain works and explaining why the brain's work feels like something from the inside might be two genuinely different projects, not just two stages of the same project. And you'll understand your own mind a little differently than you did before you closed your eyes. You'll have a clearer sense of what's actually happening, right now, in the dark, wet electricity of your own skull, to produce this exact moment of quiet awareness, this exact felt sense of being someone, lying somewhere, listening. If you fall asleep somewhere along the way, that's perfectly fine. That's actually the point of this. The whole design of tonight is built around the possibility, even the likelihood, that you will drift off before the end, that your attention will loosen, that the words will become sound, and the sound will become texture, and the texture will dissolve into whatever comes next. There's no test at the end. There's no thread you need to hold on to. There's no final exam waiting to check whether you remember the difference between the Ka and the Ba, or the exact year Wundt opened his laboratory in Leipzig, or the precise definition of the neural correlates of consciousness. The ideas will still be here, in the same order, whenever you want to come back to them. You can listen again tomorrow night. You can listen again a month from now. The arrangement of the sections isn't going anywhere. The gentle arc from ancient Egypt to modern neuroscience will still be waiting, unbothered, whenever you're ready to pick it up again, from wherever you left off, or from the beginning, if that feels right. For now, just let your body settle into wherever it's resting. Notice, without needing to change anything, the places where your weight presses down into the surface below you, the back of your head perhaps heavy against the pillow, your shoulders softening, your hips sinking, your heels resting. Let each breath come a little slower than the one before it, not forced, not controlled, just allowed to find its own quieter rhythm, the way a tide gradually slows as it reaches the top of the beach and begins its long, slow pull back out to sea. Let your attention drift toward my voice when it wants to, and away again when it wants to. There's no need to follow every word. There's no need to stay alert. The voice will keep going either way, a steady, unhurried presence in the dark. And if you catch a phrase here and a sentence there, that's more than enough. The rest will settle in without you having to work at it, the way rain settles into soil, quietly, over time, without the soil having to do anything but be there, open, receiving. Let's start a very long time ago, long before anyone was asking the question the way we ask it now, because the question of what a mind is didn't begin with a scientist. It didn't begin with a brain scan or an electrode or a carefully designed experiment. It began with people trying to explain a much simpler mystery, which is the difference between a body that is breathing and a body that has just stopped. This is, when you think about it, one of the oldest observations human beings ever made. Someone you know, someone who was warm and speaking and present a moment ago, is suddenly not warm, not speaking, not present. The body is still there. The face, the hands, the familiar shape under the blanket, all of it still physically present, still physically the same in almost every respect, and yet something essential has clearly, unmistakably departed. Something that animated the whole arrangement, that made it more than just an arrangement of matter, has gone somewhere else. The question of what that something was, and where it went, is the seed from which every later theory of mind would eventually grow. In ancient Egypt, more than 4,000 years ago, this difference was taken so seriously that an entire framework of the self was built around it. The Egyptians didn't think of a person as having one soul. They thought of a person as having several distinct parts, each with its own job, its own name, its own fate after death. This wasn't a casual belief, a vague sense that there might be different aspects to a person. It was a careful, detailed, systematic attempt to divide up something that felt, even then, like it had multiple layers, multiple components that didn't all behave the same way or persist in the same form. There was the Ka, a kind of life force, a double of the person that came into existence at birth and needed to be sustained after death with food and offerings, a part of the self that continued to need the same nourishment, in some symbolic form, that the living body had needed. There was the Ba, often shown in tomb paintings as a bird with a human head, which was closer to what we might now call personality, the part of you that could move around freely after death, that had your particular character, your particular way of being in the world, your recognizable individual stamp that made you you and not someone else. There was the Ach, which was something like the transfigured, effective spirit a person became after death, if the right rituals were performed, if the right words were spoken, if the right offerings were made. This wasn't sloppy thinking. It was a careful attempt to parse a genuine mystery, the fact that a sleeping person and a dead person look similar from the outside, and yet something is obviously, fundamentally different between them. One will wake up, the other will not. Something has left the second one that remains present, for now, in the first. The Egyptians noticed, too, that a person's character seems to persist even as their body changes over a lifetime. The face in the mirror ages, the hands grow slower, more wrinkled, the voice changes, and yet the person inside, the one who recognizes themselves as the same someone who was once a child, remains, in some hard-to-define way, continuous. They were, in their own vocabulary, already asking what stays constant when everything physical is in flux, and what leaves when a body dies. These are not small questions. They are, in slightly updated language, exactly the questions consciousness researchers are still asking today. What is the self, and can it exist apart from the body that seems to produce it? The Egyptians had no microscopes, no EEG, no functional imaging, but they had the same basic data you have right now. The felt sense of being someone, the observed difference between a living body and a dead one, and the deep, stubborn intuition that whatever accounts for that difference must be something real, something worth naming, something worth attending to with the full resources of a civilization. Around the same broad era, in Mesopotamia, similar questions were being asked in different language. The concept of the Atemu, a kind of spirit or ghost, described whatever it was that left a body at death and could, under certain conditions, linger and interact with the living. Again, this wasn't idle superstition dressed up as belief. It was an attempt to explain an observed asymmetry. A body one moment is warm, responsive, aware of its surroundings, and moments later, after death, none of that is true anymore, even though almost nothing about the physical arrangement of the body has changed in that short window. Something left, the question of what that something was and where it went, would occupy human thought for the next several thousand years, and in some ways it still does. Move forward to ancient India, and you find some of the most sophisticated early frameworks for thinking about mind that exist anywhere in the historical record. The Upanishads, composed over centuries starting around the 8th century before the Common Era, describe layers of self, called koshas, wrapping around each other like the layers of an onion. There's a layer made of food, the physical body. There's a layer made of breath, the vital energy that animates the body. There's a layer made of mind, the part that processes sensation and emotion. There's a layer made of intellect, the part that discriminates and judges. And beneath all of these, in this framework, is something called Atman, often translated as the innermost self, the witness, the part of you that is aware of all the other layers but is not identical to any of them. This is a genuinely striking idea because it draws a distinction that modern consciousness researchers still draw between the contents of experience, thoughts, sensations, emotions, and the bare fact of experiencing itself, the witnessing. The Upanishadic thinkers were essentially proposing that you are not your thoughts, you are not even your sense of self, as usually understood. You are the awareness in which thoughts and sense of self appear. Buddhist philosophy, developing a few centuries later out of the same broad Indian intellectual environment, took this even further and in a very different direction. Early Buddhist texts describe the self not as a hidden witness at all, but as a kind of ongoing process, a flow of 5 aggregates: form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness, none of which individually constitutes a fixed, unchanging self. The Buddhist claim was radical for its time and remains radical now, that the solid, continuous you that seems to be having your experiences might be, on close inspection, an ongoing construction rather than a stable thing. This is not so far from claims that some contemporary neuroscientists and philosophers make, that the unified self is something the brain generates rather than something the brain merely reports on. Think about that for a moment as you lie there. The sense you have right now of being a single, continuous someone, the same person who woke up this morning, the same person who will fall asleep tonight, might not be a simple fact that your brain passively notices. It might be something your brain is actively building, moment by moment, stitching together from many separate pieces, the way a film is stitched together from many separate still frames, creating the feeling of continuous motion where there is actually only a rapid sequence of discrete images. The self, on this view, is less like a rock sitting in a stream and more like the stream itself, a pattern that persists even though the water flowing through it is never the same water from one moment to the next. In ancient Greece, the vocabulary that would eventually shape Western thinking about mind was being built. The word psyche originally meant something close to breath or life force, the thing whose presence distinguished a living body from a corpse. Homer uses psyche mostly to describe what leaves a warrior's body at the moment of death and flies down to the underworld, and this early usage still carries the flavor of that older, near-universal intuition that life and mind are bound up with breath, with animation, with movement. When someone stops breathing, something essential departs. The chest no longer rises and falls, the warmth fades. The person who was there a moment ago is no longer there, even though the body remains. It's the same observation the Egyptians made, the same observation the Mesopotamians made, arising independently, because it's the same observation any human being would make, in any time or place, watching someone die. By the time you get to the philosophers of the 5th and 4th centuries before the Common Era, psyche has become a much richer term, something closer to what we would now call mind or soul, encompassing thought, emotion, and character together. It's no longer just the thing that leaves at death. It's the thing that thinks, that feels, that makes you the particular person you are, with your particular temperament, your particular memories, your particular way of reacting to the world. This is a genuine expansion of the concept, and it sets the stage for the first systematic Western theories of what the mind actually is, what parts it has, and how it relates to the body it inhabits. Plato, writing in the early 4th century before the Common Era, proposed that the soul, the psyche, was immortal and pre-existed the body, and that it was divided into 3 parts: a rational part associated with the head, a spirited part associated with the chest, tied to courage and emotion, and an appetitive part associated with the stomach, tied to desire and bodily need. This tripartite model was Plato's attempt to explain something everyone experiences directly, which is internal conflict. You want to eat the second slice of cake, and at the same time some other part of you knows you shouldn't. You want to say something sharp and unkind, and some other part of you holds back. You want to stay in bed, and some other part of you insists you get up. These are not, Plato argued, simply one unified will changing its mind from moment to moment. They are genuinely separate parts of the soul, pulling in different directions, and the health of a person, and by extension the health of a well-run city, depended on the rational part governing the other two. The head, in this picture, should guide the chest and the stomach, the way a wise ruler guides a city. When reason is in charge, the whole person is in harmony. When appetite or anger takes the wheel, the person becomes disordered, conflicted, pulled apart by forces that were never meant to lead. Aristotle, Plato's student, took a very different approach, and in some ways his approach anticipates modern biological thinking about mind more directly than Plato's does. In a text called De Anima, On the Soul, Aristotle argued that the soul is not some separate substance that inhabits the body like a ghost inhabits a house. Instead, he proposed that the soul is the form of a living body, the organizing principle that makes a body the particular kind of living thing it is. For Aristotle, a plant has a nutritive soul, responsible for growth and reproduction. An animal has that plus a sensitive soul, responsible for perception and movement. A human has all of that plus a rational soul, responsible for thought and reasoning. Crucially, Aristotle did not think the soul could exist apart from a body. He famously compared the relationship between soul and body to the relationship between the capacity to cut and an axe. An axe's capacity to cut isn't a separate ghostly thing riding around inside the axe. It's what the axe's particular shape and material enable it to do. In the same way, for Aristotle, the soul isn't a separate thing riding around inside the body. It's what the body's particular organization enables it to do. This is, in a real sense, one of the earliest clearly articulated versions of the idea that mind arises from physical organization, an idea that would not be seriously revived in Western thought for roughly 2,000 years, and that still underlies most of modern neuroscience. When a neuroscientist today says that consciousness is something the brain does, not something added to the brain from outside, they are, whether they know it or not, echoing Aristotle. For a long stretch after Aristotle, in both the Greco-Roman world and in the medieval world that followed it, thinking about mind became deeply entangled with theology. In the Christian tradition, Augustine, writing in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, turned inward in a way that had enormous influence on later thought. In his Confessions, Augustine treats his own memory, his own inner experience of time, and his own inner sense of self as objects of intense, searching investigation in a style that reads, even now, remarkably like introspective psychology. He describes memory as a vast inner space, containing not just facts but the felt qualities of past experiences, and he wonders openly how it is that a mind can hold within itself something as vast as the memory of the sky and the stars, when the mind itself seems to fit inside a single skull. This wondering, this sense that there is something genuinely puzzling about how an inner experience can contain, or represent, an outer world so much larger than itself, is a very old ancestor of a puzzle that is still central to consciousness research today. How does the world get inside your head? How does the vastness of a night sky, the sound of rain, the face of someone you love, all of it, get compressed into a few pounds of tissue inside a small, dark, bony box, and yet somehow retain all its richness, all its felt quality, all its meaning? Augustine didn't have an answer. Neither, in a fully satisfying way, does anyone else. But he was one of the first to write down, in detail, just how strange it is that this happens at all. By the time you reach the European Middle Ages, Aristotle's framework had been absorbed and adapted by Christian philosophers, most notably Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, who tried to reconcile Aristotle's biological account of the soul with Christian doctrine about an immortal soul that survives bodily death. This created a genuine tension that Aquinas worked hard to resolve, because Aristotle's soul was supposed to be the form of a living body, inseparable from it, while Christian doctrine required a soul that could exist, at least temporarily, without a body at all. Aquinas' solution, roughly, was to argue that the rational soul, uniquely among the types of soul, has some operations, specifically abstract thought, that do not depend directly on bodily organs, and so it can, in principle, continue to exist and function even after the body it once organized has died. Whether or not you find this convincing, it's worth noticing what's happening here. For over 1,000 years, some of the most careful thinkers available in a given civilization were wrestling, in detail, with the question of what a mind actually is, and whether it can be separated from the body that seems to produce it. This was not a settled question quietly waiting for modern science to arrive and answer it. It was a live, contested, actively debated question the entire time. The same arguments you can find in a contemporary philosophy journal about whether mind is reducible to brain or is something more were already being had, in different vocabulary, in medieval Paris and Bologna and Oxford. Before we leave the ancient and medieval world, there's one more thinker worth knowing, because his particular thought experiment anticipates Descartes so closely that some historians consider it a direct ancestor of the cogito, even though it was written roughly 600 years earlier, in a completely different intellectual tradition. This is Ibn Sina, known in the Latin West as Avicenna, a Persian polymath working in the early 11th century, who made enormous contributions to medicine, philosophy, and logic across the Islamic Golden Age, an era in which scholars working in Baghdad, Cairo, and cities across Persia and Central Asia preserved, translated, and substantially extended the philosophical inheritance of the ancient Greeks, at a time when much of that same inheritance had been largely lost to Western Europe. Avicenna proposed a thought experiment now generally called the floating man. Imagine, he asked his readers, a person created fully formed, but suspended in the air, blindfolded, with no sensory contact with anything at all, not even their own body, limbs spread so they cannot even feel one hand touch the other. Could such a person, in this condition, with no sensory information reaching them whatsoever, still know that they exist? Avicenna's answer was yes. Even stripped of every possible sensory input, he argued, this floating person would still be aware of their own existence, their own selfhood, because that awareness doesn't depend on sensory contact with a body or a world at all. It's immediate and self-evident, prior to and independent of any particular sensory experience. This is, in essence, the same core insight Descartes would arrive at nearly 600 years later through his method of radical doubt. That self-awareness is uniquely resistant to being stripped away, that a thinking self seems to be guaranteed by the very act of thinking, regardless of whether anything else, including the body, can be doubted or removed. Avicenna used this argument to support a claim that the soul, or self, is a distinct, non-material substance from the body, a conclusion strikingly close to Cartesian dualism, arrived at through a strikingly similar method, centuries before Descartes was born. It's a good reminder that the deepest questions about mind were never the exclusive property of any single culture or century. They were being independently discovered and rediscovered by careful thinkers working in very different times and places, all running into the same basic, stubborn strangeness of being a self that can reflect on its own existence. You, right now, lying in the dark, can do the same thing Avicenna's floating man did. You can close your eyes, let the sensations of your body fade into the background, and still know, with a certainty that seems to require no evidence at all, that you are here, that you exist, that there is something it is like to be you. That fact, so simple and so strange, is the foundation on which every later theory of consciousness would be built. The real turning point, the moment where the question of mind got reframed in the way we still mostly think about it today, came in the early 17th century with a French philosopher named René Descartes. Descartes was trying to solve a very specific problem. He wanted to find something he could know with absolute, unshakable certainty, something that could serve as a foundation for all other knowledge. He did this through a method of radical doubt. He asked himself, what if everything I perceive is an illusion? What if my senses are deceiving me? What if there's some powerful, deceptive force feeding false experiences into my mind, the way a puppeteer feeds movement into a puppet? Could I doubt the existence of my own body? Yes, he decided, because bodies, as objects in the world, are exactly the kind of thing a deceiver could fake. Could I doubt the existence of the external world entirely? Yes, for the same reason. But then Descartes noticed something that seemed to resist this doubt completely. Even if he was being deceived about everything else, the very act of doubting required something doing the doubting. There had to be a thinker present for there to be a thought at all, even a false one. This is the reasoning behind his famous conclusion, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Whatever else might be an illusion, the fact that there is thinking happening seemed to Descartes to be the one thing that could not be an illusion, because the illusion itself would be a form of thinking. Think about that for a moment, as you lie there in the dark. Right now, you might doubt whether the voice you're hearing is real, or whether you're already dreaming, or whether the room around you is exactly as it seems. You can doubt all of that, but you cannot, Descartes would argue, doubt that there is doubting happening, that there is hearing happening, that there is something it is like to be lying there, having these thoughts, hearing these words, even if all the contents of those thoughts turn out to be false. The fact of experience itself resists every attempt to explain it away. The experience might be a dream, the experience might be a hallucination, but the experience is. Something is happening, and you are the something it is happening to. That much, at least, cannot be removed. It is, in Descartes' framework, the one absolutely certain fact, the bedrock on which everything else must be built. From here, Descartes built an entire picture of reality with two fundamentally different kinds of substance in it. There was res extensa, extended substance, which is matter, the stuff that has size and shape and location, the stuff that bodies, rocks, and planets are made of, and which operates, Descartes believed, according to mechanical laws, the same laws that govern the increasingly sophisticated clockwork machines being built in his era. And there was res cogitans, thinking substance, which is mind, the stuff that thinks, that has experiences, that has no size or shape or location in space at all. Matter takes up space. It has length, width, and height. You can measure it, weigh it, divide it into smaller pieces. Mind does none of these things. A thought does not have a weight. A feeling of sadness does not have a shape. A memory of a summer afternoon does not occupy a particular volume in cubic centimeters. They are, in this picture, made of an entirely different kind of stuff, obeying entirely different rules, existing in an entirely different way. This division is what's now called Cartesian dualism, and it created, for the first time in a fully explicit form, the exact problem that consciousness researchers are still trying to solve today. If mind and matter are genuinely two different kinds of thing, obeying two entirely different sets of rules, then how do they interact? How does a thought, which has no physical properties at all, cause your arm, a physical object, to move? And how does a physical event, light hitting your retina, cause a mental event, the experience of seeing color? These two domains, the mental and the physical, seem to be in constant communication. Your decision to shift your weight slightly causes your body to actually shift. A sound in the room causes a change in your inner experience. And yet, if they are made of entirely different substances, there is no obvious bridge between them. It's as though you had two neighbors who spoke completely different languages, shared no common vocabulary, and yet managed to have long, detailed, perfectly coordinated conversations every single day. The fact that they do communicate is obvious. How they manage to do it, given that they share no common medium, is deeply puzzling. Descartes proposed, somewhat unsatisfyingly even to many of his contemporaries, that the interaction happened in a small structure deep in the brain called the pineal gland. He believed this tiny, pea-sized organ was uniquely suited to be the meeting point between the mental and the physical, because, unlike most brain structures, it isn't duplicated on both sides of the brain. Most parts of the brain come in pairs, one on the left, one on the right, mirror images of each other. But the pineal gland sits alone, right in the center, and Descartes imagined it as a kind of valve or gateway, the single point where the non-physical mind could push on the physical machinery of the brain, and where physical sensations could cross over into the non-physical realm of thought. This specific proposal didn't hold up. We now know the pineal gland is primarily involved in producing melatonin, the hormone that helps regulate sleep, and there is no evidence it serves as a portal between two different kinds of reality. But the deeper problem Descartes had identified, now generally called the mind-body problem, absolutely did hold up, and it has never been fully resolved. It's the problem that needed solving, and in an important sense, it's still the problem that needs solving now. The mind-body problem isn't just an abstract philosophical puzzle. It has real consequences for how you understand basic facts about yourself. When you decide to lift your arm, and your arm lifts, something has to explain that connection. Either your mental decision is, in some sense, identical to a physical brain event, which would mean dualism is false and everything is ultimately physical, or your mental decision is a genuinely separate kind of thing that somehow reaches into the physical world and pushes it around, which raises the question of how something non-physical could exert physical force without violating the basic physical principle that the total energy in a closed system stays constant. Energy cannot be created from nothing. If a thought, which has no mass and no energy in any measurable sense, causes a chain of neural firing that leads to a muscle contraction, then somewhere in that chain, new energy would have to enter the physical system from outside it. Physicists have never found any evidence of such a thing happening. The total energy in any isolated system, including, presumably, the system of your brain and body, stays exactly the same over time. So either the mental is not genuinely separate from the physical, or there is some entirely unknown kind of causation at work, one that doesn't show up on any of our instruments and doesn't obey any of the conservation laws the rest of physics depends on. Neither option is obviously comfortable. The first option, that everything is ultimately physical, seems to threaten the specialness of experience, the felt quality of things, what philosophers would later call qualia, the redness of red, the particular ache of sadness, the specific taste of salt. If a thought is just a pattern of neurons firing, why does it feel like anything at all to have that pattern of neurons firing? Why isn't the brain just a machine that processes information and produces behavior, with nobody home, no inner light on, the same way your laptop processes information without, presumably, experiencing anything as it does so? Your laptop can detect light levels and adjust screen brightness. It can process audio input and produce audio output. It can store memories and retrieve them later. It does all of this, as far as we can tell, without any inner awareness at all. It is a very sophisticated information processor with the lights completely off inside. So what is different about your brain? Why does its information processing come with a felt experience, while the laptop's processing, as best we can determine, does not? This is the question physicalism must eventually answer, and it has not yet done so in a way that satisfies everyone, or even most people, who study it seriously. The second option, that mind is a separate substance, seems to require some account of how that separate substance interacts with the physical world in a way that doesn't break physics, and after 400 years of trying, nobody has produced a satisfying account of that mechanism. The pineal gland didn't work. No other candidate structure has fared any better. The interaction problem remains exactly what it was in Descartes' time, a gap in the picture that no amount of additional detail has managed to fill. By the time you reach the 18th and 19th centuries, a series of thinkers were trying different ways out of this bind. Baruch Spinoza, writing in the mid-17th century, not long after Descartes, proposed a strikingly different picture. Rather than mind and matter being two separate substances, Spinoza argued they were two aspects, two ways of describing a single underlying substance, which he sometimes called God or nature. On this view, called dual aspect monism, every physical event has a corresponding mental aspect, and every mental event has a corresponding physical aspect, not because one causes the other, but because they are, at bottom, the same event, seen from two different angles. Imagine a single object, a cylinder, seen from one side as a rectangle and from the other side as a circle. The rectangle doesn't cause the circle, and the circle doesn't cause the rectangle. They are simply two different views of the same underlying reality. Spinoza suggested that mind and matter might work the same way. When you look at a brain event from the outside, with instruments and measurements, you see neurons firing. When you experience that same event from the inside, you feel a thought or a sensation. There is no causal connection to explain, because they were never two separate things in the first place. They were always one thing, viewed through two different kinds of access. This idea would echo forward for centuries, resurfacing in various forms in later philosophy of mind, and it remains an active, live option in the debate today. Gottfried Leibniz, writing slightly later, proposed yet another solution, that mind and body don't interact at all, but were set up by God, at the beginning of time, to run in perfect parallel, like two clocks wound to keep identical time without ever touching each other. Whenever your mind decides to raise your arm happens to rise at that exact moment, not because the decision caused the raising, but because both were independently scheduled to occur together, from the very start of creation. Your thought and your movement are like two perfectly synchronized timepieces, each running on its own internal mechanism, each keeping perfect step with the other, but never actually influencing each other in any direct way. This view, called pre-established harmony, strikes most people today as strange, to put it mildly. But it shows how seriously and how creatively thinkers were willing to work in order to avoid the interaction problem Descartes had exposed. Leibniz understood, as clearly as anyone, that if mind and matter are truly distinct substances, then any causal link between them poses a deep, perhaps insoluble, difficulty. His solution was to eliminate the causal link entirely, while keeping the appearance of interaction intact, by appealing to a cosmic coordination established at the beginning of everything. It's an extreme solution, but it's an honest one, because it takes the problem seriously enough to propose something genuinely radical in response. The 18th century also produced a materialist countercurrent, thinkers who argued there was no separate mental substance at all, and that everything, including thought, was ultimately physical process. Julien Offray de la Métrie, a French physician, published a work in 1747 called Man a Machine, arguing bluntly that thought is simply a property of a sufficiently organized nervous system, and that there is no need to posit any non-physical substance to explain it. He pointed to the close relationship between physical states and mental states, how a fever can cause delirium, how a blow to the head can erase memory, how alcohol and other substances can alter mood and judgment, as evidence that the mind depends so intimately on the body that separating them made no sense. This was, at the time, a genuinely scandalous position, seen by many as dangerously atheistic, because it seemed to strip away any basis for an immortal soul. If the mind is just the brain doing its work, then when the brain stops working, the mind stops too. There is no afterlife. There is no soul that survives the death of the body. There is just the physical process, running for a while and then ending. This was not a popular view in a deeply religious century, and La Métrie faced serious consequences for publishing it. But it planted a seed that would eventually grow into modern materialist neuroscience, the idea that whatever consciousness is, it is something the brain does, not something added to the brain from outside. The first real breakthrough, the moment mind stopped being purely a subject for philosophical argument and became a subject you could actually run experiments on, arrived in the middle of the 19th century, and the person most responsible for it was a German physicist and philosopher named Gustav Fechner. Fechner had a simple but genuinely powerful idea. If mind and body are connected, even if we don't know exactly how, then there should be a measurable, mathematical relationship between changes in physical stimulation and changes in subjective experience. He set out to test this directly. He would have a person hold two weights, one fixed, one gradually changed, and ask them at what point they could just barely detect a difference between the two. He found something remarkable and consistent. The amount of physical change needed to produce a noticeable difference in experience wasn't a fixed amount. It scaled with the size of the original stimulus. If you're holding a very light weight, a tiny increase is noticeable. If you're holding a very heavy weight, that same tiny increase is not noticeable at all. You need a much larger increase before you can tell the difference. This relationship, first described more informally by Ernst Weber and then formalized mathematically by Fechner into what's now called the Weber-Fechner law, was the first time anyone had shown a precise, repeatable, mathematical relationship between a physical quantity out in the world and a subjective quantity inside someone's mind. This might not sound dramatic on its face, but think about what it actually demonstrated. It showed that subjective experience, the kind of thing Descartes had placed in an entirely separate, non-measurable realm, actually obeys law-like regularities, the same way physical phenomena do. The feeling of heaviness, the inner, private, subjective sense of how weighty something is, varies in a predictable way according to a mathematical formula. If experience follows mathematical laws, then experience is, in some sense, a legitimate object of scientific study, not just a private, unreachable inner theater that science could never touch. Fechner had opened the door to what he called psychophysics, the systematic study of the relationship between physical stimuli and mental sensation, and in doing so, he had effectively founded experimental psychology, even though the field wouldn't get that name and its first dedicated laboratory for another couple of decades. The mind, after centuries of being the exclusive property of philosophers and theologians, had become, for the first time, something you could measure. Not completely, not in all its aspects, but enough to show that it was not beyond the reach of systematic, empirical investigation. That was a genuine turning point, and everything that has happened in the science of consciousness since then can be traced, in one way or another, back to Fechner's simple, careful, patient experiments with small weights and attentive observers held in a quiet room more than 150 years ago. That laboratory arrived in 1879 in Leipzig, Germany, founded by Wilhelm Wundt, who is generally credited as the founder of psychology as a distinct experimental discipline. Wundt's central method was something called introspection, but a very disciplined, trained version of it, quite different from simply thinking about your own feelings in a casual way. Wundt trained his research subjects, often his own graduate students, to observe their own immediate conscious experience under carefully controlled conditions, and to report it in precise, standardized terms, breaking experience down into elementary components, sensations, feelings, and images, the way a chemist might break a compound down into elements. The underlying assumption, sometimes called structuralism, particularly as it was later developed by Wundt's student Edward Titchener in the United States, was that consciousness, like matter, is built out of basic elements that combine according to certain rules, and that if you could carefully catalog those elements and their combinations, you would have a genuine science of the mind. This approach had real limits, which later psychologists were quick to point out. Introspective reports are hard to verify from the outside. If one trained observer says that a particular shade of blue feels cool and distant, and another trained observer, looking at the same shade under the same conditions, says it feels warm and inviting, there is no external check, no measurement you can take to determine which of them is correct. They might both be accurately reporting their own private experience, and those experiences might genuinely differ, or one of them might be mistaken about what they are actually experiencing, confusing a memory or an association with the raw sensation itself. There's no way to tell from the outside, and that makes introspection a frustratingly unreliable tool for building a public, verifiable science. Different trained observers sometimes reported quite different things when looking at what was supposed to be the same experience, and the method seemed to work poorly for anything beyond the simplest sensory experiences. struggling badly when applied to complex thought or emotion. You can train someone to report, with reasonable consistency, whether a light seems brighter or dimmer than a comparison light. But try to get them to break down the experience of reading a poem, or remembering a childhood home, or feeling a subtle shift in mood, into elementary components, and the whole enterprise begins to unravel. The elements refuse to stay still. The experience changes as you try to observe it. The very act of paying close attention to a feeling alters the feeling itself, the way looking directly at a faint star in the night sky can sometimes make it disappear. But the foundational move Wundt made, treating consciousness as something that could be studied with careful, repeatable, laboratory methods rather than pure armchair speculation, was itself the breakthrough. It established, as a working assumption within a serious scientific discipline, that the mind was not off limits to empirical investigation. Before Wundt, the study of the mind was largely a branch of philosophy. You sat in a chair and thought carefully about thinking, and you wrote down your conclusions, and other people read them and agreed or disagreed, and the whole conversation happened at the level of argument and counter-argument, with no clear way to settle any dispute definitively. After Wundt, the study of the mind became, at least in principle, something you could do in a laboratory, with measurements and controls and the slow, patient accumulation of data. This was a genuine shift, not just in method, but in the basic understanding of what kind of thing the mind was. It was no longer a soul, mysterious and untouchable, but a natural phenomenon, like heat or light or chemical reactions, something that could be systematically investigated by anyone with the right tools and the right training. It's worth pausing here on the core idea underneath both Fechner's and Wundt's work, because it's a foundational concept that will keep coming back throughout tonight, in more and more sophisticated forms. The idea is this: consciousness, whatever else it is, has a structure. It's not an undifferentiated fog. It's not a single uniform glow, the same in all directions, with no internal variation. It's built out of distinguishable parts, sensations that differ in quality and intensity, moments that follow one another in a felt sequence, contents that can be attended to or ignored. If you think about your own experience right now, lying there, you can probably notice several different things happening within it. The felt weight of a blanket against your legs, the sound of my voice with its particular pitch and rhythm, a faint thought drifting through about tomorrow, or about something that happened earlier today, or about nothing in particular, a general sense of drowsiness, a heaviness behind the eyes, a slowing of the breath. These are distinguishable elements, coexisting within a single unified experience, at a single moment. They don't blend into each other the way two colors of paint blend into a third color. The sound of my voice remains a sound, and the feeling of the blanket remains a feeling, and the drowsy thought remains a thought, all present together, all part of one moment, and yet each distinct, each with its own character, its own felt quality. Fechner showed that at least one dimension of this structure, the relationship between stimulus intensity and perceived intensity, obeys mathematical law. The inner feeling of heaviness, which seems so private and so qualitative, actually varies in a predictable, mathematically describable way as the outer physical weight changes. Wundt tried to catalog the elements more broadly, to identify the basic building blocks of experience, the way Mendeleev had identified the basic building blocks of matter in his periodic table. Neither of them solved the deep mystery of why any of this structure is accompanied by felt experience at all, rather than simply happening unfelt, the way it presumably happens in a thermostat that also, in a very loose sense, senses temperature and responds to it. A thermostat detects a change in temperature and triggers a response. It does something that looks, from a certain distance, a little bit like what your nervous system does when it detects a change in temperature and triggers a shiver or a reach for a blanket. But nobody thinks the thermostat feels warm or cold. Nobody thinks there is something it is like to be a thermostat, a tiny inner glow of temperature awareness, a faint but real experience of the room cooling down. It just does what it does, mechanically, with the lights off. So why isn't your brain the same? Why does its temperature detection come with a felt sensation of coldness, a quality that seems to be about something more than just the physical process itself? Neither Fechner nor Wundt could answer that question, but they took the crucial first step of insisting that structure could be studied scientifically, piece by piece, rather than dismissed as forever private and untouchable. They showed that you could make progress on the easy problems, the problems of structure and function, even if the hard problem, the problem of felt experience itself, remained, and remains, out of reach. At almost exactly the same time, Wundt was building his laboratory in Leipzig. A very different kind of investigation into the mind was getting underway in Vienna, one that would end up shaping popular ideas about consciousness even more than academic psychology did for much of the 20th century. Sigmund Freud, trained originally as a neurologist, began developing through the 1890s and into the early 1900s a theory built around a claim that seems modest now, but was genuinely radical at the time, that conscious awareness represents only a small portion of total mental activity, and that a much larger portion of what drives human thought, feeling, and behavior happens entirely outside conscious awareness, in a region of the mind he called the unconscious. This wasn't a wholly new idea. Leibniz had gestured at something similar centuries earlier with his concept of small, unnoticed perceptions, tiny mental events that influence us without ever crossing the threshold into awareness. And several of Freud's own contemporaries were independently developing related ideas about unconscious mental processes. But Freud built the idea into a full clinical and theoretical system, a complete architecture of the mind, with its own structures and dynamics and rules of operation. He argued that unconscious material, particularly memories and desires considered unacceptable or threatening by the conscious mind, don't simply vanish. They don't fade away like a photograph left in the sun. They get actively pushed out of awareness through a process he called repression, and they continue to exert real influence on behavior from below the surface, sometimes emerging in disguised form, through dreams, through slips of the tongue, through symptoms that seem, on the surface, to have no clear physical cause at all. A person who has no conscious memory of a frightening event from childhood might still find themselves gripped by an inexplicable fear in situations that echo that event in some way they cannot name. A person who has pushed down an unacceptable desire might find that desire expressing itself in a dream, disguised as something else, a symbol that stands in for the real thing without triggering the same internal alarm. The unconscious, in Freud's picture, is not a passive storage room for forgotten material. It's an active, dynamic, often turbulent region of the mind, full of forces pushing and pulling against each other, shaping the small portion of mental life that reaches the surface in ways the surface itself cannot detect. Freud later proposed a structural model dividing the mind into three components. The id, a reservoir of basic instinctual drives operating entirely unconsciously, the raw, primitive urges for pleasure and avoidance of pain that we are born with and never fully outgrow. The superego, an internalized set of moral standards and prohibitions, also operating largely outside conscious awareness, the voice of parents and teachers and society that has been absorbed so deeply it no longer feels like an external demand, but like an internal fact about right and wrong. And the ego, the part of the mind that consciously navigates between the demands of the id, the constraints of the superego, and the practical realities of the outside world, the harried mediator trying to satisfy two harsh masters while also dealing with the ordinary challenges of daily life. The ego is the part you think of as yourself, the conscious I that makes decisions and forms intentions and reflects on its own experience. But in Freud's picture, the ego is not the master of the house. It is, in his own famous phrase, not even the master in its own house. It is more like a servant, trying to balance the demands of forces much larger and older than itself, aware of only a small fraction of what is actually driving its own behavior at any given moment. Much of the specific machinery Freud proposed, repression, the detailed symbolism he assigned to dreams, the particular stages of psychosexual development he described, has not held up well under later scientific scrutiny. Psychoanalysis as a clinical method has been extensively criticized, particularly from the 1970s onward, for resting on claims that are difficult or impossible to test rigorously. How do you prove that a particular dream symbol represents a particular repressed wish? How do you verify that a patient's symptom is caused by an unconscious conflict rather than by some other factor entirely? The methods of psychoanalysis are interpretive, not experimental, and they depend heavily on the skill and the theoretical commitments of the individual analyst, making them hard to validate in the standardized, repeatable way that modern science requires. But the core insight underneath Freud's elaborate theoretical architecture, that a great deal of what shapes human thought and behavior happens outside conscious awareness entirely, turns out to have been substantially vindicated by later, more rigorous research, even as nearly all of Freud's specific mechanisms were being set aside. Modern cognitive science has its own, empirically grounded version of an extensive unconscious, sometimes called the cognitive unconscious. This is not the Freudian unconscious of repressed desires and hidden conflicts. It's a much more ordinary, much less dramatic kind of unconscious, encompassing everything from the automatic, effortless processing involved in recognizing a face, to implicit biases that measurably shape judgment and behavior without a person's awareness or endorsement, to the kind of unconscious processing revealed by Dehaene's masked word experiments discussed a little later tonight, where information demonstrably influences behavior for a stretch of time before, if it ever does, crossing over into conscious report. You do not consciously decide how to parse the grammar of a sentence you hear. The parsing happens automatically, below the surface of awareness, and the finished meaning is delivered to your conscious mind as a completed package. You do not consciously construct the three-dimensional depth of the room around you from the two-dimensional images on your retinas. The construction happens automatically, using rules and assumptions you never learned and could not articulate, and the finished three-dimensional world is simply there, in your experience, as though it had been directly perceived rather than elaborately constructed. Freud got a great deal of the specific machinery wrong, in other words, but he was arguably the first thinker to place the sheer scale of unconscious mental activity at the very center of a serious theory of mind, and in that specific respect, contemporary neuroscience has ended up agreeing with him more than the mid-20th century behaviorists, who dismissed psychoanalysis as unscientific, would ever have predicted. The unconscious, in one form or another, is now a standard, uncontroversial part of the scientific picture of how the mind works. Most of what your brain does, it does without you. You are the visible tip of an enormous, invisible iceberg, and the shape of that tip is determined, far more than it feels like it is, by the vast hidden mass beneath the surface. Not everyone was convinced this approach was the right one, and the reaction against introspective psychology led to one of the most influential and, in retrospect, most limiting developments in the entire history of mind science: the rise of behaviorism, beginning in the early 20th century with American psychologist John B. Watson, and later extended and popularized by B.F. Skinner. Watson argued in a 1913 paper often described as the Behaviorist Manifesto that psychology should abandon the study of consciousness altogether because it wasn't objectively measurable, and should instead restrict itself entirely to observable behavior, stimulus and response, input and output, with the internal workings of the mind treated as an unopenable black box, irrelevant to a truly scientific psychology. For several decades, particularly in American academic psychology, this became the dominant approach. Researchers studied how animals and humans learned associations between stimuli and responses, how behavior could be shaped through reward and punishment, and they deliberately avoided any talk of inner experience, feelings, images, or subjective states, treating such talk as unscientific, closer to folk mythology than to real science. Think about what that meant in practice. A behaviorist studying fear would not ask a person to describe what their fear felt like from the inside. They would not inquire about the racing heart, the tightness in the chest, the sense of impending danger that seems to color every thought. All of that was considered private, unverifiable, and therefore outside the bounds of proper science. Instead, the behaviorist would measure what they could see from the outside. How close would the person approach a feared object? How quickly would they pull their hand away from a stimulus associated with a mild shock? How many sessions of gradual exposure did it take before the avoidant behavior disappeared? Fear, in this framework, was not a feeling. It was a pattern of avoidance and physiological response, nothing more. If you could predict and control the pattern, you had explained everything worth explaining. The inner experience, whatever it was, added nothing to the scientific account. Skinner, extending this approach through the middle of the 20th century, went so far as to argue that even complex human behaviors like language could, in principle, be fully explained through conditioning, through patterns of reinforcement, without any need to invoke an inner mental life doing the work at all. A child learns to say milk not because they have an inner thought they are trying to express, but because making that sound in the presence of a caregiver has been reinforced in the past by receiving milk. The sound is reinforced, so the sound is repeated. The inner meaning, the felt intention, the conscious experience of wanting something and choosing words to express that want, all of that was, for a strict behaviorist, unnecessary to the explanation. It was the kind of story people told themselves about what was happening, but it wasn't science. Science dealt only with the observable facts, the sounds coming out of the child's mouth, the milk arriving, the increased probability that the sound would be made again under similar circumstances. The historical irony here is significant and worth sitting with. In the effort to make the study of mind rigorously scientific, behaviorism ended up, for a time, essentially banishing the mind from psychology altogether. Consciousness itself, the very thing that had motivated Fechner and Wundt to build their laboratories in the first place, the thing Descartes had placed at the very center of his whole philosophical system, the thing Augustine had explored with such care in his Confessions, the thing the Upanishadic sages had described as the innermost witness, all of it, the entire subject matter of the investigation, became almost a forbidden topic in serious academic psychology for the better part of half a century. You could study learning, you could study memory, as long as you defined memory purely in terms of observable changes in behavior rather than inner acts of recollection. You could study perception, as long as you defined it purely in terms of discriminative responses rather than conscious sensations. But you could not, if you wanted to be taken seriously as a scientist, study consciousness itself. The word became slightly embarrassing, a relic of an earlier, less rigorous era, like phlogiston or the luminiferous ether, something that had once seemed necessary to explain the data, but that turned out, on closer inspection, to be unnecessary, and therefore not real. It would take a genuinely new development, a new set of tools and a new central metaphor, to bring consciousness back to the center of scientific attention, and that development is where the next major chapter of this story begins. The return of consciousness to serious scientific study is usually dated to what's called the cognitive revolution, a shift that gathered force through the 1950s and 1960s. Several things converged to make it happen. One was a growing dissatisfaction with behaviorism's limits, most famously expressed in a scathing 1959 review by linguist Noam Chomsky of Skinner's book Verbal Behavior. Chomsky argued that human language simply could not be explained by reinforcement and conditioning alone, that children produce and understand sentences they've never heard before, following complex grammatical rules, far too quickly and too reliably for pure trial and error learning to account for it. A child doesn't learn to say, "I good to the store," by hearing adults say it. Adults don't say that. They say, "I went to the store." The child hasn't imitated what they've heard. They've applied a rule, the rule that past tense is formed by adding ed to the end of a verb, and they've applied it to an irregular verb, producing a sentence they've never encountered before. This is not imitation. This is not reinforcement. This is something else, something internal, a system of rules that the child has somehow extracted from the messy, partial, often ungrammatical speech they actually hear around them, and that system is generating sentences. Something inside the mind, some internal structure, had to be doing real computational work, and pretending that structure didn't exist, or didn't matter, was preventing psychology from explaining some of the most basic facts about how people actually think and speak. The second major influence was the rise of computing itself. In the 1940s and 1950s, engineers and mathematicians, including Alan Turing, had developed the theoretical and practical foundations of digital computers, machines that processed information according to formal rules, taking in input, transforming it through a series of steps, and producing output. This gave psychologists an entirely new metaphor to work with, one that behaviorism had explicitly forbidden itself from using. Instead of treating the mind as an unopenable black box, you could treat it as something like a computer, a system that takes in sensory information, processes it through internal representations and rules, and produces behavior as output. Crucially, this metaphor made internal mental states scientifically respectable again, because a computer's internal states, its stored data, its running program, are not mystical or unmeasurable. They're just a different level of description from the physical circuits implementing them, a level you can study in its own right, using its own appropriate methods. You can't directly see the data stored in a computer's memory by looking at the hardware. You have to interact with the software, ask the right questions, run the right tests. But the data is real. The program is real. They are legitimate objects of study. And if the mind is something like a computer, then its internal states, its representations and rules and processes are also real, also legitimate objects of study, even if you can't see them directly by opening the skull and looking inside. This new field, drawing together psychology, linguistics, computer science, and philosophy, became known as cognitive science, and it treated the mind as an information processing system worth studying on its own terms, rather than either a forbidden black box or a purely physical mechanism with nothing more to say about it. You could study the mind as a kind of software running on the hardware of the brain, and you could make progress on understanding how that software worked, even if you didn't yet fully understand the hardware it was running on. This was a genuine liberation. It allowed researchers to talk about memory again, not just as a change in behavior, but as a stored representation. It allowed them to talk about attention, not just as a pattern of orienting responses, but as a selection mechanism that filtered information before it reached awareness. It allowed them to talk about consciousness again, not as a mysterious ghost in the machine, but as a particular kind of information processing state, one that could be studied, in principle, like any other. At around the same time, neuroscience itself was rapidly developing new tools that would eventually let researchers look inside the working brain directly, rather than relying only on behavior or self-report. In the 1920s, German psychiatrist Hans Berger had discovered that the electrical activity of the human brain could be recorded from the scalp using electrodes, producing what he called the electroencephalogram, or EEG. This gave researchers, for the first time, a continuous, real-time readout of gross patterns of neural electrical activity, and it revealed something immediately relevant to consciousness, that the pattern of this activity changes dramatically and systematically depending on the state of consciousness a person is in, with distinct, recognizable signatures for being awake and alert, for the different stages of sleep, and for the loss of consciousness under anesthesia. You could literally watch, on a rolling strip of paper, the moment a person fell asleep, as the rapid, irregular, low-amplitude waves of wakefulness gave way to the slower, more regular, higher-amplitude waves of deep sleep. You could watch the moment they entered a dream, as the brain suddenly shifted back into a pattern that looked, in many ways, more like wakefulness than like the deep sleep that had preceded it. Consciousness, or at least the gross state of being conscious versus unconscious, was no longer something you had to infer purely from behavior. It left a visible trace, a signature in the electrical rhythms of the brain itself. In the following decades, researchers developed increasingly precise tools for recording the activity of individual neurons, work associated with figures like David Hubel and Torsten Wiesel, who in the 1950s and 1960s used microelectrodes to record from single neurons in the visual cortex of cats, and found that individual neurons respond selectively to very specific features of the visual world. One neuron firing strongly for a bar of light at a particular angle, another firing for a bar at a different angle, revealing that the visual system builds up complex representations of the world out of many simple, specialized detectors working together. This was a direct, physical demonstration of exactly the kind of structured, componential processing that Wundt had proposed existed within conscious experience nearly a century earlier, except now it could be seen directly in the actual electrical firing of actual neurons, rather than inferred indirectly from a trained observer's verbal report. The elements of consciousness that Wundt's introspectionists had struggled to catalog from the inside were now being mapped, one by one, from the outside, in the firing patterns of individual cells. Later in the 20th century, an even more powerful set of tools arrived, imaging technologies that could show patterns of brain activity across the entire living human brain, non-invasively, while a person was awake and behaving. Positron emission tomography, developed through the 1970s, and then functional magnetic resonance imaging, developed and refined through the 1990s, allowed researchers to see which regions of a living human brain became more metabolically active during specific mental tasks, by tracking blood flow and oxygen use, which rise in regions doing more work. For the first time, a researcher could ask a question like, what is different in the brain when a person consciously perceives a briefly flashed image, compared to when the exact same image is flashed too quickly to be consciously perceived, and get a real, physical, image-based answer, rather than a purely philosophical one. You could literally watch, on a screen, as the brain shifted from one pattern of activity to another, correlating with a shift in the person's subjective report from, "I didn't see anything," to, "I saw it clearly." The gap between the first-person and the third-person perspective was beginning to close, or at least to show where the bridges might one day be built. This opened up an entirely new research program, the search for what came to be called the neural correlates of consciousness, usually abbreviated NCC, meaning the minimum set of neural events and structures that are sufficient, on their own, for the occurrence of any specific conscious experience. This phrase and research program was given its clearest formulation by Francis Crick, who had earlier co-discovered the structure of DNA, and his collaborator Christoph Koch, who together, beginning in the early 1990s, argued that consciousness research needed a sharper, more tractable target than the vague old question of what consciousness fundamentally is. Instead, they proposed, researchers should focus on the more answerable empirical question of exactly which neural events, in exactly which brain structures, correlate reliably with the presence or absence and the specific content of conscious experience. Don't ask what consciousness is, in the abstract, as though it were a single thing with a single definition. Ask what is different, physically, when someone is conscious of a particular thing, compared to when that same thing is processed by the brain, without reaching awareness. Find the neural signature, map the territory. Let the larger philosophical questions wait, and in the meantime, gather the data that might eventually help answer them. This reframing was hugely influential, because it turned consciousness from an untestable philosophical puzzle into a set of concrete, testable empirical hypotheses that laboratories all over the world could actually investigate. You could design an experiment. You could put someone in a scanner. You could show them images or play them sounds under carefully controlled conditions, some of which they would consciously perceive and some of which they wouldn't. You could compare the brain activity in the two cases, and you could start to build up, piece by piece, a detailed picture of what the brain does differently when consciousness is present versus when it is absent. This was no longer armchair philosophy. It was bench science, with all the usual tools of bench science, measurement, control, replication, and the slow, patient accumulation of results that gradually, over decades, begins to reveal the shape of the thing you're studying. The mind, after its long exile under behaviorism, was back on the scientific agenda, and this time, for the first time in history, researchers had tools that might actually let them see how it worked. Out of this convergence, cognitive science, new brain imaging tools, and the search for neural correlates, came the layer of theory that most directly shapes how consciousness researchers think today, and we're going to spend real time on the core of it, slowly, starting with the foundational concept that most modern theories build from in one way or another, before we go any deeper into the details of how the brain actually seems to do this remarkable thing. If you're still with me, let your eyes close now if they aren't already. You don't need to follow every word from here forward, just let it wash over you, the way you'd let a familiar voice on the radio wash over you in a dark car on a long drive. The explanation keeps going either way, and there's nowhere you need to catch up to. Just rest, and let the words arrive, or not arrive, as they will. Let's talk now about how this actually seems to work, as best anyone currently understands it, the actual mechanics of how a few pounds of wet tissue produces something that feels like anything at all. Start with a basic observation about your brain right now. At this exact moment, an enormous amount of processing is happening inside your skull that you are not conscious of. Your brain is regulating your heart rate. It's maintaining your blood pressure. It's monitoring the position of every joint in your body. It's processing the texture of whatever surface you're lying on, adjusting your muscles slightly to stay balanced even while still. If you're wearing clothing, your brain is processing the sensation of fabric against your skin, and mostly ignoring it. None of this reaches what you would call your conscious experience most of the time. It happens, but it happens in the dark, so to speak, without any accompanying felt quality, without anyone home to notice it. Your heart beats, your lungs expand and contract, your blood vessels tighten and relax to keep your blood pressure steady as you shift from one position to another. All of this is regulated, monitored, adjusted, moment by circuits in your brainstem and elsewhere, and you are not aware of any of it. You couldn't be, even if you tried. The signals don't reach the parts of the brain that support conscious experience. They stay local, encapsulated, doing their jobs quietly, in the dark. And yet some information, some tiny fraction of everything your nervous system is processing at any given moment, does become conscious. You do notice the sound of my voice. You might notice a stray thought about something from today. You might notice the feeling of warmth where the blanket touches your skin, or a slight ache in a shoulder, or the slow rhythm of your own breathing, once it's pointed out to you. The question at the heart of consciousness science is, what is different about that small fraction of processing that becomes conscious compared to the vast amount that doesn't? What does it take for information processing to be accompanied by experience? What flips the switch from processing in the dark to processing in the light? One of the most influential answers to this question is called global workspace theory, first proposed by cognitive scientist Bernard Bars in the late 1980s, and later developed further with more detailed neural grounding by neuroscientists Stanislas Dehaene and Jean-Pierre Changeux. The core idea is best understood through an analogy Bars himself used. Imagine a theater. Most of what happens in a theater production happens backstage, unseen by the audience. The carpenters building the set, the costume designers, the people managing the lighting rig, all working away, unseen and uncoordinated with each other in any direct way. The carpenter doesn't need to know what the lighting designer is doing. The costume designer doesn't need to coordinate directly with the sound engineer. Each one works in their own specialized space, on their own specialized task, and the results of their work stay largely within that space. But there's a spotlight, and whatever falls under that spotlight, on the stage, becomes visible to everyone in the theater at once, and importantly, becomes available to everyone in the theater at once. The lighting crew can react to it. The sound crew can react to it. The actors waiting in the wings can react to it. The spotlight doesn't just illuminate, it makes whatever it illuminates globally available, shared across the whole system in a way that backstage work never is. Global workspace theory proposes that your brain works in a similar way. There are enormous numbers of specialized, unconscious processing modules running constantly. A module handling color, a module handling motion, a module handling the sound of speech, a module handling memories relevant to your current situation, and normally they operate in relative isolation, each doing its job, feeding results forward, without those results being broadcast anywhere else. The color module doesn't need to tell the memory module what it's doing. The motion module doesn't need to share its output with the language module. They work in parallel, independently, efficiently, each one a small specialist, doing its small specialized task, the way the carpenter and the lighting designer work separately backstage. But certain information, under certain conditions, gets selected, amplified, and then broadcast widely, to many different brain systems at once, through a network of long-range connections, especially involving the prefrontal and parietal regions toward the front and top of the brain. Once information is broadcast this way, once it's on the metaphorical stage, under the spotlight, it becomes available to memory systems, to language systems, to planning systems, all at the same time, and it's this global availability, this widespread broadcasting, that global workspace theorists identify with conscious experience itself. On this view, being conscious of something isn't a special, separate ingredient added to information processing. It's not a mysterious glow that gets poured over certain neural events, transforming them from unconscious to conscious, the way a lamp transforms a dark room into a lit one. It is a particular functional state that information can be in, the state of being globally broadcast and made widely available, rather than staying local and encapsulated. Information that stays local stays unconscious. Information that gets broadcast becomes conscious. The difference is not what the information is made of or where it comes from, but what happens to it next, whether it stays in its own small corner of the brain or gets shared across the whole vast network. Consciousness, in this picture, is less like a thing and more like a status, a change in how information is handled, rather than a change in what the information fundamentally is. This theory makes a very specific, testable prediction, which is part of why it's been so influential, and Dehaene and colleagues have tested it extensively using EEG and other imaging techniques. If you flash a word on a screen very briefly and then immediately follow it with a burst of visual noise, a technique called masking, you can push the exposure time right to the edge of conscious perception. At certain durations, a person will report seeing nothing, just noise, even though their brain clearly processed the word, because you can show, using clever indirect tests, that the word still influences their behavior, priming them to respond faster to related words. For example, the word got in, it was processed, it reached the visual system and activated the relevant circuits. But it never made it to the stage. It stayed backstage, doing its work in the dark, influencing behavior, without ever becoming something the person could report seeing. At slightly longer durations, past a certain threshold, the person suddenly reports seeing the word clearly, a genuine subjective experience of recognition. What Dehaene's research found is that this transition isn't gradual, at the level of the brain. Below the threshold, brain activity for the word stays confined mostly to early visual processing areas and fades quickly. The word activates the visual cortex, but the activation doesn't spread. It stays local, contained, and then it dies away. Above the threshold, there's a sudden, late, and widespread burst of activity, appearing across frontal and parietal regions, roughly a third of a second after the word appears, an event Dehaene calls ignition. This late, widespread, sudden ignition looks exactly like what global workspace theory predicts a conscious perception should look like, a moment where information stops being locally processed and starts being globally broadcast, all at once, in a way that's almost binary. Either it ignites or it doesn't, with very little in between. There's no such thing as being half conscious of the word, on this view. Either the global broadcast happens, and you see it, or it doesn't, and you don't. The ignition is the moment the lights come on, the moment backstage work becomes stage performance, the moment information becomes experience. A different, and in some ways more ambitious theory, comes at the problem from an entirely different angle, starting not from brain anatomy, but from information itself. This is integrated information theory, developed primarily by neuroscientist Giulio Tononi, beginning in the early 2000s. Tononi starts from a slightly unusual place. Instead of asking what physical structures produce consciousness, he asks, what are the essential properties that any conscious experience has, just from the inside, regardless of what's producing it? He identifies several. Your experience right now is definite. It's specifically this experience and not some other one. Out of all the possible experiences you could be having, you are having exactly this one, with this particular sound, this particular bodily feeling, this particular quality of drowsiness. It's structured. It has many distinguishable parts within it: sound, thought, bodily sensation, existing together. It's not a single uniform blob with no internal differentiation. It has shape, texture, composition, and crucially, it's unified, it's integrated. You don't experience the sound of my voice and the feeling of your blanket as two separate, disconnected experiences happening in parallel. You experience them together, as aspects of one single, unified moment of consciousness. They are bound into a single whole, and that whole has a quality that the separate parts, taken individually, do not have. Tononi then asks what kind of physical system could produce experience with exactly these properties, and his answer centers on a mathematical quantity he calls phi, a measure of how much integrated information a system generates, above and beyond the information generated by its separate parts considered independently. The intuition behind this, without the mathematics, works like this. Imagine a system made of many parts that are wired together in such a way that the system's overall state genuinely depends on the specific pattern of connections between the parts, not just on the parts individually. If you tried to describe what that system is doing by describing each part in isolation, you would lose something, some information about the whole that only exists because of how the parts are integrated together. A system with high integrated information is one where the whole is, in a very literal, measurable sense, irreducible to its parts. You cannot fully describe the system by describing its components one by one and then adding up the descriptions. The way the components interact creates something new, something that vanishes the moment you try to take the system apart. Tononi's theory proposes that the amount of integrated information a physical system generates corresponds directly to the amount, and even something like the quality, of consciousness that system has, and that a system needs to be doing this kind of richly interconnected work on itself, not merely processing information in a simple, sequential assembly line fashion for consciousness to be present at all. A system that processes information in a purely feed-forward way, with each step simply passing its result to the next step and then falling silent, might accomplish complex tasks but would generate very little phi, and therefore, on this theory, very little or no consciousness. What matters is not just the complexity of the processing, but the depth and richness of the interconnections, the way the parts talk back to each other, the way the whole system's state at any moment reflects not just the current input, but the entire history of its own internal interactions. Consciousness, in this picture, is not a broadcast. It's a kind of inward-turning, self-reflective integration, a system generating information about itself, for itself, in a way that cannot be reduced to a simple sum of independent parts. This leads integrated information theory to some genuinely startling and controversial predictions, which are worth sitting with because they show how differently this theory frames the whole problem compared to global workspace theory. On this view, consciousness is not restricted to brains or even to biological systems. It's a property of any sufficiently integrated physical system, whatever it's made of, which means the theory predicts that even simple physical systems might have a tiny, faint degree of consciousness, if they have even a little bit of integrated information, an idea sometimes described as a form of panpsychism, though Tononi is careful to note that the amount would be vanishingly small for most simple systems. A thermostat, on this view, might have a microscopic flicker of something, not a thought, not a feeling, Nothing remotely like the rich, structured experience you're having right now, but perhaps the faintest possible hint of a point of view, the barest minimum of what it might be like to be something rather than nothing. A simple photodiode, a sensor that distinguishes light from dark, might have an even tinier flicker. Not because it behaves intelligently, not because it processes complex information, but because it has, in its minimal two-state way, a tiny amount of integrated information, a state that depends, in some vanishingly small measure, on the way its parts are connected to each other, not just on the parts themselves. More strikingly, the theory predicts that a computer running a program that behaves exactly like a conscious system from the outside, producing all the right outputs for all the right inputs, might still have zero consciousness on the inside, if the underlying physical architecture of the computer, typically built from highly centralized, low-integration components even when running complex software, doesn't generate high integrated information, regardless of what the software running on top of it appears to be doing. You could have a machine that passes every behavioral test for consciousness, that converses fluently, that describes its own inner states in vivid and convincing detail, that insists, sincerely and at length, that it feels joy and sorrow and the warmth of the sun on its skin, and yet, if its internal architecture doesn't generate high phi, there would be, on this theory, no one home to actually feel any of it. Just a very sophisticated performance, running in the dark. This is a direct challenge to the older computer metaphor view of mind that came out of the cognitive revolution, which tended to assume that what matters for consciousness is the pattern of information processing, the software, regardless of what hardware is running it. Integrated information theory says the hardware, the actual physical architecture, matters enormously, not just for producing the right behavior, but for whether any experience is present at all behind that behavior. You could run the same software on two different kinds of hardware, and one might be conscious while the other was not because the software was different, but because the physical structure of the machine running it generated different amounts of integrated information. There's a related and equally important problem that both of these theories, in different ways, are trying to address, called the binding problem. Here's the puzzle. When you look at, say, a red ball rolling across the floor, your brain processes color, shape, and motion in genuinely separate regions, using genuinely separate neural populations, with color processed substantially in one area, motion processed in a largely different area, shape processed using yet another set of overlapping but distinct circuits. These are not just different neurons, they are different neighborhoods of the brain, sometimes inches apart in neural terms, which is a vast distance at that scale. The color of the ball is being analyzed by one group of cells in one location. The motion of the ball is being analyzed by a different group of cells in a different location. The shape of the ball is being analyzed by a third group, overlapping with the first two, but not identical to either. And yet, your experience isn't of three separate things: a color experience, a shape experience, and a motion experience, floating independently. It's of one thing, a red ball, rolling, unified. The redness doesn't float off to the left while the roundness hovers to the right, and the motion trails behind. They are bound together, seamlessly, into a single object, a single moment of experience, a single thing happening to a single you. Somehow the brain combines, or binds, information that is physically processed in separate locations into a single, coherent, unified conscious experience. How does this binding happen? One influential proposal, developed especially by neuroscientist Wolf Singer and colleagues, starting in the 1980s and 1990s, is that binding is achieved through timing, specifically through the synchronization of neural firing. The idea is that neurons in the color area processing this particular red ball and neurons in the motion area processing this particular rolling movement start firing in a synchronized rhythmic pattern with each other, often in a frequency range called the gamma band, roughly 40 cycles per second. They fire together, not in the sense of being physically connected, but in the sense of keeping time with each other, the way two musicians in different parts of an orchestra play the same note at the same moment, creating a harmony that neither could produce alone. It's this temporal synchrony, this shared rhythm, that effectively tags the separately processed features as belonging together, as parts of one object, one experience, even though they never physically travel to some central location to be combined. The binding happens not in space but in time. The neurons don't need to send their signals to a common meeting point. They just need to fire in step, and the brain reads that synchrony as a signal that these features belong to the same thing. Other researchers, working within the global workspace framework, propose a complementary answer, that binding happens through the global broadcast itself. Once separately processed features are all made available together, on the same metaphorical stage, at the same time, to the same wide set of downstream systems, that shared availability is itself what creates the sense of unity, without requiring any additional synchronization mechanism at all. The color information and the motion information may arrive at the stage through different doors, but once they're both there, illuminated by the same spotlight, available to the same audience of memory systems and planning systems and language systems, they are experienced as belonging together simply because they are being experienced together, as parts of the same global moment. The binding is not a separate process that happens before consciousness. It is part of what becoming conscious is. Underlying both of these major theories, and much of the broader neuroscience of consciousness, is a deep dependence on specific anatomical structures, particularly a small, deep brain structure called the thalamus, and its rich, two-way connections with the cortex, the thin, heavily folded outer layer of the brain, responsible for most complex processing. The thalamus is sometimes casually described as a relay station, passing sensory information up to the cortex, but this description understates its role considerably. A relay station simply passes messages along. It doesn't change them, doesn't shape them, doesn't participate in the conversation. But the thalamus is not a passive relay. The thalamus and cortex are connected in dense feedback loops, not simple one-way relays. Information flows from thalamus to cortex and immediately back again, repeatedly, in rapid cycles. It's less like a relay station and more like a conversation, a continuous back and forth, in which each side shapes what the other side does next. Many researchers now believe that consciousness depends critically on the health and activity of this thalamocortical loop specifically, rather than on the cortex alone, or the thalamus alone. It's the loop that matters, the ongoing exchange, not any single part of the circuit considered in isolation. This is strongly supported by clinical evidence. Damage to certain thalamic structures, even quite small and localized damage, can produce profound and lasting disorders of consciousness, while damage to even fairly large areas of cortex, if the thalamocortical loop through the remaining tissue stays intact, often leaves basic consciousness itself relatively preserved, even when specific abilities, specific contents of consciousness, like the ability to recognize faces or to understand language, are lost. A person with damage to a specific cortical area might lose the ability to see color, or to recognize faces, or to understand speech, but they remain conscious. They are still there, still experiencing, still a self, just a self with a reduced or altered set of contents. But a person with damage to certain small regions of the thalamus, even if the cortex above is entirely intact, can lose consciousness altogether. They can fall into a deep, lasting, unresponsive state, not because the cortex has been destroyed, but because the loop that keeps it active and integrated has been broken. The cortex is still there, still capable in principle of processing information, but without the thalamic conversation partner, it falls silent, or at least falls into a state that doesn't support conscious experience. This has led to a useful working distinction in consciousness research between the level of consciousness, whether a person is conscious at all, in any minimal sense, which seems to depend heavily on subcortical structures, including the thalamus and the brainstem's arousal systems, and the content of consciousness, what specifically a person is conscious of, which seems to depend much more on the specific cortical areas engaged and how they're connected to each other in that broadcasting, integrating way both major theories describe. The level is like the power switch on a radio. If it's off, there's no sound at all, no matter how many stations might be broadcasting. The content is like the particular station you're tuned to, the specific music or voices filling the room at any given moment. The level depends on the deep, ancient structures of the brainstem and thalamus. The content depends on the cortex, the thin, folded, distinctively human outer layer, where most of the detailed processing happens. Both are necessary for a full, rich, conscious experience. Neither is sufficient on its own. One more mechanism deserves real attention here, because it changes how you should think about consciousness in a fairly deep way, and that's the role of prediction. For a long time, perception was assumed to work roughly like a camera, passively recording the world and passing that recording up through increasingly sophisticated processing stages until a conscious picture emerged at the end. Light hits the retina sends signals to the visual cortex. The visual cortex processes those signals into shapes and colors and motion, and the finished picture is then presented to the conscious mind, the way a photograph is presented to someone looking at it. This is a natural, intuitive picture of how seeing works. It feels, from the inside, like you simply open your eyes and the world pours in, fully formed, and you receive it, passively, the way a lake receives the image of the sky. Over the past 2 or 3 decades, a competing and increasingly well-supported framework called predictive processing has substantially revised this picture. On this view, the brain isn't primarily a passive recorder of incoming sensory data, it's primarily a prediction engine. At every level of the nervous system, from very early sensory processing all the way up through the most abstract conceptual thought, the brain is constantly generating predictions about what it expects to sense next, based on its accumulated model of the world, and then comparing those predictions against the actual signals arriving from the senses. What gets passed further up the processing hierarchy, and what most strongly shapes conscious experience, is not the raw sensory signal itself, but primarily the error, the mismatch, the difference between what was predicted and what actually arrived. Your brain is not waiting to see what comes in. It is constantly guessing what will come in, and most of what it experiences is its own guesses, corrected only where the guesses turn out to be wrong. This is a genuinely strange thing to sit with. It suggests that a great deal of what you experience as directly, immediately perceived reality is actually your brain's best current guess about reality, continuously and rapidly updated and corrected by a comparatively thin stream of actual sensory error signals, rather than being built up fresh from raw sensory data at every moment. You are not seeing the room around you. You are seeing your brain's prediction of the room around you, shaped by everything you've ever learned about how rooms look, how light falls, how shadows behave, and then corrected, slightly, by the small mismatches between that prediction and the actual light hitting your retinas. The experience you're having is less like a photograph and more like a very good sketch, drawn from memory, with a few small corrections penciled in where the memory turned out to be slightly off. Most of the sketch is yours, drawn by you, from the inside out. Only the corrections come from the outside in. This framework helps explain a wide range of otherwise puzzling phenomena. Why visual illusions work at all? Because they exploit the brain's predictive assumptions about how light and shadow and geometry normally behave, creating a mismatch that the system cannot resolve. Why context so powerfully shapes what you perceive? Because context shifts your brain's predictions, priming you to expect certain things and making you more likely to perceive them, even when the actual sensory evidence is ambiguous. And even why, under conditions of sensory deprivation or certain neurological and psychiatric conditions, people can experience vivid hallucinations, because with weak or absent sensory error signals to correct them, the brain's predictions run forward largely unconstrained, and those unconstrained predictions are themselves experienced as though they were direct perception, because on this model, that's essentially what perception always is. A constrained, corrected prediction all the way down. When you dream tonight, you'll be experiencing this directly. The sensory input will be largely shut off, but the predictive machinery will keep running, generating worlds, and with no error signals to pull it back toward reality, those worlds will feel as real as the one you're in now. There's one more piece of machinery worth understanding clearly, because people often confuse it with consciousness itself, and it's genuinely a separate thing, closely related but distinct, and that's attention. Attention is the mechanism by which the brain selects a subset of all the information available to it for further, deeper processing, essentially amplifying some signals and suppressing others. Think of it as a kind of filter, or a gate, or a set of priorities. At any given moment, your senses are bombarded with far more information than you could possibly process fully. The sound of my voice, the hum of whatever appliance sits in the corner of the room, the feel of the fabric against your skin, the slight pressure in your lower back, the faint smell of the air, the visual field even behind your closed eyelids. If your brain tried to give equal weight to all of this, to process everything at the same depth at the same time, it would be overwhelmed. Attention is the solution to that problem. It's the mechanism that says, this, not that. This voice, not the hum. This thought, not the dozens of other thoughts hovering at the edges. This is what matters right now, and everything else can wait. You can demonstrate that attention and consciousness are not identical using a clever category of experiment. In certain carefully designed tasks, researchers can show that a stimulus is being attended to, in the sense that it measurably affects behavior and neural activity in ways characteristic of attention, and yet the person never becomes consciously aware of it at all, reporting seeing nothing. The stimulus is processed. It influences the person's responses. Their brain devotes resources to it. And yet, when asked, they genuinely believe they saw nothing, because the processing never crossed the threshold into conscious experience. Conversely, there's reasonably good evidence that under specific conditions, some very simple, unattended information can still, faintly, reach conscious awareness, at what researchers sometimes call the fringe of attention. You've probably had this experience yourself, lying in a quiet room, when a sound you hadn't been paying attention to, a clock ticking, a distant car, suddenly surfaces into awareness, and you realize it's been there all along, ticking away, unnoticed but not entirely absent from your experience. It was at the fringe, present but not prominent, conscious but not attended. This matters because it tells you that attention is probably best understood as one of the mechanisms that helps determine what becomes conscious, one of the gatekeepers that decides which information gets amplified enough to reach the kind of global broadcast that global workspace theory describes, rather than being the same thing as consciousness itself. Attention is more like the spotlight operator, deciding what to point the spotlight at, while consciousness, on this analogy, is the illumination itself. Once something is under the light, the spotlight operator can point the light at something without the light actually turning on. The light can be dimly present even where the spotlight isn't aimed. But normally, in ordinary waking life, the two work closely together. What you attend to becomes conscious. What you ignore fades into the background. They are partners, not identical twins, and understanding the difference between them is one of the subtle but important achievements of the last few decades of research. Attention's underlying machinery also gives some insight into why consciousness feels the way it does moment to moment, why it has the particular narrow serial quality it has, rather than feeling like everything is experienced at once, with equal clarity. Your visual system alone receives an enormous amount of information every second, far more than could plausibly be globally broadcast and consciously processed all at once, without overwhelming the rest of the brain's processing capacity. The bandwidth is limited. The stage can only hold so much at one time. Attention functions as a bottleneck, a necessary filtering step, that keeps the amount of information reaching full conscious, globally broadcast status manageable. It narrows the stream. It selects a few things to bring into the light and leaves everything else in the dark, not because the dark things aren't being processed, but because there simply isn't room on the stage for all of them at once. This is part of why you can have a vivid, detailed visual world in front of you and still fail to notice something as large and obvious as a person in a gorilla costume walking through the middle of a scene, in the famous selective attention experiments conducted by psychologists Daniel Simons and Christopher Chabris in the late 1990s. In these experiments, participants were asked to watch a video of people passing a basketball and count the number of passes made by one of the teams. It's a demanding task. You have to focus. You have to track the ball, ignore the other team, keep a running count in your head. And while you're doing this, a person in a full gorilla costume walks slowly through the middle of the scene, stops, beats their chest, and walks off. A remarkable proportion of people, when asked afterward, report seeing no gorilla at all. Not a vague sense that something might have been there, a complete absence. They are stunned when the video is replayed and the gorilla is pointed out to them. They were looking right at it. Their eyes were pointed in the right direction. The light from the gorilla suit hit their retinas, activated their visual cortex, was processed to a meaningful extent. And yet, for a large proportion of observers, it never gets broadcast widely enough, never reaches the threshold of ignition Dehaene's research describes, to become part of conscious experience at all. This single, startling, easily replicated finding does more to demonstrate the gap between raw sensory processing and conscious experience than almost any amount of philosophical argument could, because it shows, directly and repeatably, that a great deal of unconscious processing can happen, using the same eyes, the same early visual cortex, without producing any conscious experience whatsoever, if the machinery that selects information for global broadcast happens to be pointed somewhere else. The gorilla walked through the spotlight's beam, but the spotlight operator was busy counting basketball passes, and so the gorilla never made it to the stage. It was processed backstage, in the dark, and then forgotten. This is not a failure of the visual system. It's how the visual system works all the time. It selects, filters, and prioritizes, and what it doesn't select, what it doesn't prioritize, simply doesn't become part of your experienced world, even if it's right in front of your open eyes. Underneath all of this selective, structured, predictive processing sits a more basic requirement, which is simply having the right level of overall neural arousal for any of it to happen at all, and this depends heavily on a set of ancient structures deep in the brainstem, sometimes collectively called the ascending reticular activating system, which sends widespread activating signals up through the thalamus to the cortex, essentially setting the overall gain, the overall level of responsiveness of the entire system. Think of it as the volume knob on a radio. If the volume is turned all the way down, it doesn't matter what station you're tuned to or how clearly the signal is being broadcast. No sound comes out. The system is off. The ascending reticular activating system is what turns the volume up, keeps the cortex in a state where it can respond to input, process information, and generate the kind of integrated broadcast activity that seems to underlie conscious experience. When these brainstem arousal structures are damaged, even when the thalamus and cortex above them are entirely intact and structurally healthy, the result can be a complete and often permanent loss of consciousness, a coma, because the cortex, however sophisticated its wiring, has no capacity to generate the widespread activation needed for anything like global workspace ignition or high integrated information on its own, without that steady stream of arousal input arriving from below. The cortex is like a very sophisticated radio receiver, capable of picking up and processing an extraordinary range of signals. But without power, without that basic activating input from the brainstem, it's just a piece of hardware, silent and dark. The brainstem arousal systems are evolutionarily ancient, shared in some form with creatures that branched off from our lineage hundreds of millions of years ago. They are not uniquely human. They are not even uniquely mammalian. They are part of the deep old machinery of being an awake, responsive animal. And yet without them, all the more recently evolved, sophisticated cortical machinery that supports human consciousness is useless. It cannot turn itself on. This gives you a useful layered picture of the whole system, worth holding in mind as we go further tonight. At the base, brainstem arousal structures provide the basic switch, the raw capacity for the system to be on at all. Above that, the thalamocortical loop provides the medium in which rich, integrated, structured processing can occur. Within that medium, mechanisms like attention and predictive error signaling determine which specific information gets amplified and elaborated. And at the top of that chain of amplification, when information is sufficiently amplified and sufficiently integrated, something like global workspace ignition, or a substantial rise in integrated information, or quite possibly both, occurring together, marks the transition from unconscious processing to a genuine, felt, conscious experience. Layer upon layer, each one depending on the ones below it, each one enabling a richer, more complex kind of processing than the one before. The brainstem provides the power, the thalamus and cortex provide the connectivity, attention and prediction shape the flow, and somewhere in that flow, when the conditions are just right, the lights come on, and processing becomes experience. This is, right now, the closest thing consciousness science has to a working, mechanistic story, built up carefully over more than a century of research, from Fechner's weights to Dehaene's masked words. It's a genuinely impressive amount of understanding, and it still, honestly, leaves the deepest part of the mystery completely untouched, a point we'll come back to later tonight, because none of these mechanisms, however precisely described, actually explain why any of this processing should be accompanied by felt experience at all, rather than happening, just as effectively, in the dark. You can describe the layers in exquisite detail. You can map the circuits, measure the timing, track the ignition as it spreads across the cortex. You can show that when the ignition happens, the person reports seeing the word, and when it doesn't, they don't. You can predict with increasing accuracy which brain states will correspond to which conscious reports. And still, when you've done all of that, you're left with the same question that Descartes asked, that Avicenna asked, that the Upanishadic sages asked. Why does any of this feel like anything? Why is there a first-person perspective at all? The mechanisms tell you how the system works. They don't tell you why the system's workings are accompanied by an inner life. That gap between mechanism and felt experience is the hard problem, and it's still there, at the end of all this careful, patient, brilliant work, as open as it ever was. Now that you have a sense of the core machinery, it's worth walking through the different major branches of thought that have grown out of it, because researchers don't all agree on which mechanism matters most, and these disagreements aren't just academic squabbling. They lead to genuinely different predictions about which systems, biological or otherwise, might have some form of consciousness. If global workspace theory is right, then what matters most is the global broadcast, the widespread sharing of information across many brain systems. A creature or a machine that can achieve that kind of broadcast, regardless of what it's made of, might have some form of conscious experience. If integrated information theory is right, then what matters most is the specific physical architecture, the way the parts are connected, the amount of integrated information the system generates about itself. Creature or a machine might behave exactly like a conscious being, passing every test we can devise, and still have no inner experience at all, if its internal architecture doesn't generate high phi. If higher order theories are right, then what matters most is the capacity for self-monitoring, the ability of the system to represent its own states to itself. A system that processes information brilliantly, but cannot reflect on its own processing, might be unconscious, while a simpler system with the right kind of self-reflective capacity might have at least a dim form of awareness. These are not small differences. They lead to different answers about whether a dog is conscious, whether an octopus is conscious, whether an artificial intelligence system, however fluent and convincing its conversation, is conscious. They lead to different answers about what we owe to other beings, which creatures can suffer, which systems have interests that deserve moral consideration. The theoretical debates that might seem, from the outside, like philosophers splitting hairs, turn out to have real, practical consequences. Consequences that are becoming more urgent as we build machines that behave more and more like conscious beings, and as we confront the evidence that many animals, including some we have long treated as insentient, show signs of having inner lives of their own. The next time you look at your phone, or at a sleeping pet, or at the sky above the room you're resting in, you're looking at something that the major theories of consciousness would assess in genuinely different ways, and those differences matter, not just for science, but for ethics, for law, for how we understand our place in a world that might be far more full of experience than we once assumed. We've already met two of the major frameworks in some depth: global workspace theory, which locates consciousness in the widespread broadcasting of information across many brain systems, and integrated information theory, which locates consciousness in the amount of irreducible, integrated information a physical system generates about itself, regardless of what that system is made of. There's a third major family of theories worth understanding well, called higher-order theories, which take yet another angle on the problem. The basic idea, developed in various forms by philosophers and cognitive scientists including David Rosenthal and, more recently, in an updated neuroscientific version, by Hakuan Lao, is that a mental state becomes conscious not simply by being processed or even by being broadcast widely, but specifically by being the target of another, higher-order mental state, a kind of internal representation about the first representation. Think about what this means in ordinary terms. Your brain is constantly processing information. Some of that information is about the outside world, the sound of a voice, the color of an object, the temperature of the air. Some of that information is about your own body, the position of your limbs, the state of your internal organs. But higher-order theories propose that none of this becomes conscious until there is, in addition, a representation of the representation, a thought about the thought, a kind of internal monitoring that says, in effect, I am currently seeing red, or I am currently hearing a voice, or I am currently feeling tired. It's not enough to see red. You have to also represent, somewhere else in the brain, the fact that you are seeing red. Only then does the redness become something you consciously experience, rather than something your brain merely processes in the dark. On this view, having a conscious visual experience of red isn't just a matter of your visual system processing red successfully. It requires a separate, higher-order system, one that many researchers associate particularly with parts of the prefrontal cortex, forming a representation that essentially says, of the lower-order visual state, something like, this system is currently representing red. Consciousness, on this account, is fundamentally about the mind representing its own states, monitoring itself, rather than simply processing information about the outside world, however richly that processing might be integrated or broadcast. A creature that could process visual information perfectly well, but lacked the capacity to represent to itself that it was processing that information, would, on this view, be unconscious. It would see, in the sense that its eyes and visual cortex would respond to light, but it wouldn't know that it was seeing. There would be no inner awareness of the seeing, no felt experience of the redness of red, just the processing itself, running in the dark. This theory has some genuinely interesting implications, particularly around a phenomenon that trips up simpler theories, cases where a person's higher-order judgment about their own experience seems to come apart from what a lower-level measure of their processing would suggest. The most striking example of this is a condition called blindsight, a neurological phenomenon usually resulting from damage to the primary visual cortex. Patients with blindsight report being completely unable to consciously see anything in a particular region of their visual field. If you hold up an object in that region, they will tell you, sincerely, that they see nothing at all. The world, for them, is simply absent in that part of space. And yet, when forced to guess about objects presented in that supposedly blind region, they perform far better than chance would predict. They can correctly guess the location of an object, its orientation, even its simple identity, all while insisting that they cannot see it at all. They are, in a real sense, seeing without knowing that they are seeing. The visual information is getting in. It's being processed by alternative pathways that bypass the damaged visual cortex. It's guiding behavior, but it never becomes conscious. The person never has the experience of seeing. Higher-order theories interpret this as a case where lower-level visual processing is intact enough to guide behavior, but the higher-order monitoring system that would normally represent that processing and thereby render it conscious has been damaged along with the visual cortex it depends on. The lower-order processing is still happening quietly in the dark. The person can reach out and grab an object they insist they cannot see. They can adjust their grip to match the shape of something they report having no visual experience of. The information is there, doing its work, but the higher-order representation that would say, "I am seeing that object," is absent. And without that higher-order representation, there is no conscious experience, just accurate unconscious guidance, running silently below the surface of awareness. A fourth major approach, somewhat different in flavor from the previous three, comes out of a longer philosophical and now increasingly scientific tradition called enactivism, or sometimes embodied cognition, associated particularly with philosopher Alva Noe and, earlier, with Francisco Varela. This view pushes back against a shared assumption in most of the theories discussed so far, the assumption that consciousness is something produced entirely inside the brain, as a kind of internal representation or model of the world, with the body and environment merely feeding information in as raw material. The brain, on the enactivist view, is not a computer in a dark room, generating an internal simulation of a world it never actually touches. It is part of a living body, and that body is part of an environment, and the conscious experience emerges from the ongoing, active relationship between all three. You don't just passively receive the world, you engage with it, you move through it, you touch it and are touched by it. Your experience is not a picture inside your head, it is a way of being in the world. Enactivists argue instead that conscious perception is best understood not as an internal picture the brain constructs and then experiences, but as an ongoing, active, skillful interaction between a whole organism, brain, body, and environment together, in real time. On this view, part of what makes visual experience feel the particular way it does isn't just neural activity in the visual cortex. It's your ongoing, embodied mastery of the way visual input changes systematically as you move your eyes, turn your head, walk around an object. When you look at a coffee cup on a table, you don't just passively receive an image of a coffee cup. You know, in a deep, embodied way, what will happen to that image if you tilt your head, or move to the left, or reach out and turn the cup around. That knowledge, that expectation, that skillful readiness to engage with the object is, on the enactivist view, part of what makes the experience of seeing the cup what it is. A creature without a body capable of this kind of active exploration, on the strongest versions of this view, might struggle to have anything like human visual experience at all, no matter how sophisticated its internal information processing was, because the experience is understood as partly constituted by the active loop between brain, body, and world, not by internal processing alone. This remains a minority position relative to the internalist theories, but it has been genuinely influential in pushing consciousness researchers to take the body, and not just the brain in isolation, more seriously as part of the picture. It reminds us that the brain did not evolve in a vacuum. It evolved in a body, and that body evolved in a world, and the whole system, brain, body, and environment, has been shaped by millions of years of interaction. Consciousness may not be something that happens entirely inside the skull. It may be something that happens in the space between the organism and its world, in the active, ongoing, never-ending process of engagement that defines what it means to be alive. Beyond these major theoretical frameworks, there's a set of positions less about mechanism and more about the fundamental status of consciousness in nature, and these are worth understanding because they represent genuinely different bets about what kind of universe we live in. Physicalism, the default working assumption of most neuroscience, holds that consciousness is entirely a product of physical processes, fully explainable, in principle, without remainder, in physical terms, even if we don't yet have that full explanation. On this view, consciousness is not a special addition to the physical world. It's just what certain kinds of physical systems do. The way water is just what H2O molecules do when they're arranged in the right way. There's no extra ingredient, no mysterious non-physical stuff. Just matter, arranged in very particular patterns, doing very particular things. And one of the things it does, when arranged just right, is produce experience. This is a clean, elegant view, and it's the working assumption behind most laboratory research on consciousness, but it leaves the hard problem untouched. It doesn't explain why any physical arrangement, no matter how complex, should produce felt experience rather than just complex but unfelt processing. Panpsychism, a much older view that has seen a serious revival among a number of contemporary philosophers, including Philip Goff, holds that consciousness, or at least some extremely simple precursor to it, is a fundamental, basic feature of physical reality itself, present in some minimal form even in simple physical systems, with complex consciousness like yours, arising from some as yet poorly understood combination of these basic conscious elements, rather than emerging from wholly non-conscious matter, the way water's wetness emerges from non-wet water molecules. This is a genuinely strange idea to sit with, but it's motivated by a real logical worry, the intuition that consciousness seems categorically different from every other physical property we know how to explain, and that trying to get consciousness to emerge from purely non-conscious ingredients might be a bit like trying to get wetness to emerge from ingredients that don't have anything at all resembling wetness among them, even in trace form, no matter how you arrange them. If none of the fundamental ingredients of the universe have even a trace of experience, how does experience ever get started? Where does the first flicker of awareness come from, if there's nothing awareness-like anywhere in the basic building blocks? Panpsychism solves this by saying that awareness was always there, in some minimal, basic form, from the very beginning, and that complex consciousness is what happens when you combine many simple awarenesses in just the right way. At the opposite extreme sits illusionism, a position associated especially with philosopher Keith Frankish, which argues that the deepest, most puzzling aspect of consciousness, the vivid, ineffable, seemingly non-physical felt quality of experience, what philosophers call qualia, isn't actually real in the way it seems to be. On this view, your brain represents its own states to itself in a way that makes those states seem to have a rich, irreducible, non-physical felt quality, even though, according to illusionists, they don't actually have any such quality. They're simply physical information states that the brain's self-monitoring system misrepresents to itself as having this special, ineffable character. The redness of red isn't a real thing, a genuine quale that floats above the physical processes of the brain. It's a kind of internal illusion, a very convincing error the brain makes about its own states. It represents itself as having an experience of a vivid, qualitative red, but that representation is, strictly speaking, false. There is no actual redness. There's just the physical processing, and the physical processing includes a mechanism that generates a false but very compelling report that there is something more, something qualitative, something that resists physical explanation. Illusionists don't claim that nothing is happening. They don't deny that information processing, attention, and self-monitoring are real. They claim specifically that the felt, qualitative aspect of experience, the part that seems hardest to explain physically, is itself a kind of very convincing internal illusion, a cognitive error the brain makes about its own states, and that once you see through this illusion, the mind-body problem becomes much easier, because you're no longer trying to explain something, felt quality, that never actually needed physical explaining in the first place, because it was never actually there as advertised. This is one of the most controversial positions in the entire field, deeply unsatisfying to many people on first hearing it, because it seems to be denying the single most obvious fact any of us has direct access to, the fact that experience feels like something, right now, to you. Illusionists respond that this objection, however strongly and sincerely felt, is exactly the kind of response their theory predicts you would have, whether or not the theory is true, which makes the whole debate genuinely difficult to settle through introspection alone. The very fact that the illusion feels so real, so undeniable, is part of the illusion. That's what makes it a good illusion. and you can't refute the theory by pointing to how strongly you feel the presence of your own qualia, because the theory already predicts that you would feel exactly that way, whether or not the qualia were actually there. These are not small disagreements. They go to the very heart of what kind of universe we live in. Is consciousness a late, local product of particular kinds of biological organization, something that happened to arise here on this planet after billions of years of evolution? Or is it a fundamental feature of reality, present from the very beginning, as basic as mass or charge, built into the fabric of things? Or is it, in some sense, not quite real, a very convincing story the brain tells itself, a user interface rather than a genuine window onto a separate kind of reality? The answer you give to these questions shapes not just how you think about your own mind, but how you think about the minds of others, about the minds of animals, about the possibility of machine consciousness, about the place of experience in a universe that science otherwise describes in purely physical terms. It's worth sitting with each of these possibilities for a moment, as you lie there in the dark, letting them settle, not trying to choose between them, just letting them be present, the way you might let several different pieces of music play quietly at the same time, each one offering a different perspective on the same underlying silence. It's also worth spending real time on a variation within consciousness itself that you experience directly every single day, though you rarely think about it this way, and that's the variation across different states of consciousness, across the sleep cycle, because it offers some of the clearest natural evidence for everything discussed so far. When you fall asleep tonight, you'll pass through a well-documented sequence of stages, identifiable clearly on EEG recordings. Your brain doesn't simply switch off like a light. It doesn't go from awake to asleep in a single smooth transition. It moves through a series of distinct states, each with its own characteristic pattern of electrical activity, its own signature on the EEG, and each with its own relationship to conscious experience. In the lighter stages of non-REM sleep, cortical activity slows and becomes more synchronized, large groups of neurons tending to fire together in slow, rolling waves, rather than the more varied, desynchronized pattern typical of wakefulness. When you're awake, your cortex is like a crowded room full of people all having different conversations at the same time. The electrical activity is complex, varied, constantly shifting. As you drift into light sleep, the conversations begin to merge. Neurons start firing in unison, large populations pulsing together in slow, rhythmic waves. Subjective experience, if it's present at all during these stages, tends to be minimal, fragmentary, thought-like rather than vividly perceptual. You might have a brief, fleeting image, a snippet of a thought, a sense of falling or floating, but nothing like the rich, structured, narrative experience of either full wakefulness or full dreaming. The stage is dimming. The broadcasts are becoming less frequent, less coherent. The integration is loosening. In the deepest stage of non-REM sleep, sometimes called slow-wave sleep, this synchronization becomes extreme, with very large populations of cortical neurons falling into a rhythmic pattern of collectively switching on and then completely off, up and down, in slow, powerful waves that sweep across the entire cortex. This is a pattern researchers using the tools of integrated information theory have specifically studied, because it offers a natural experiment in reduced integration. When all your neurons are firing in perfect lockstep, all doing the same thing at the same time, the system as a whole becomes less than the sum of its parts. The complexity drops. The information generated by the whole is barely more than the information generated by any single part, because all the parts are doing the same thing. And the finding is striking. During these deep, highly synchronized slow-wave states, measures of integrated information drop sharply, and reports of conscious experience, when people are woken up directly out of this stage, drop correspondingly, with most people reporting nothing, or nearly nothing, was happening. They were not dreaming, they were not thinking, they were not experiencing anything at all. They were simply absent, a gap in the record, a stretch of time that, from the inside, might as well not have happened. Then, roughly 90 minutes into the sleep cycle, something changes dramatically. The brain enters REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, and cortical activity suddenly resembles wakefulness far more closely than it resembles the deep sleep stage that preceded it. The slow, synchronized waves give way to a desynchronized, varied pattern, showing patterns of connectivity across regions that look, on many measures, remarkably similar to an awake brain. The crowded room is back. The separate conversations have resumed. The cortex is active, integrated, broadcasting, doing all the things it does when consciousness is present. And subjective experience during REM sleep is anything but minimal. This is the stage most strongly associated with vivid, immersive, often bizarre dreaming, full sensory detail, narrative structure, strong emotion, all happening while the body remains almost completely paralyzed, through an active brainstem mechanism that suppresses movement specifically during this stage, presumably to prevent a sleeper from physically acting out a dream. Your mind is wandering through strange landscapes, having conversations with people who don't exist, feeling terror or joy or longing with an intensity that can match or exceed waking life. And yet your body lies still, your muscles effectively switched off, your eyes moving rapidly behind closed lids, the only visible sign of the rich inner world unfolding inside. What makes REM sleep such a valuable natural laboratory for consciousness research is exactly this dissociation, a state where sensory input from the outside world is largely shut out, and yet a rich, vivid, internally generated conscious experience is running anyway. Your eyes are closed. The room around you is dark and quiet. Very little sensory information is making its way into your cortex, and yet you are having experiences, vivid experiences, full of light and sound and motion and feeling. This offers direct support for the predictive processing idea discussed earlier, that a great deal of ordinary waking perception is itself a constrained internal prediction, and that dreaming may be something close to what that same predictive machinery produces when the external sensory signals that normally constrain and correct it are almost entirely absent. In waking life, your brain generates predictions about what it expects to sense, and those predictions are corrected by incoming sensory data. In dreaming, the predictions keep running, but the corrections are largely absent. The result is a world built entirely from the inside out, a pure prediction, unconstrained by reality, and yet experienced as real, sometimes hyper-real, while it's happening. You don't know you're dreaming. The predictive machinery doesn't label its own output as internally generated. It presents it to you the same way it presents waking perception, as a world simply there, to be experienced. One further variation deserves mention here, because it bears directly on some of medicine's hardest and most emotionally difficult cases, and that's the range of disorders of consciousness that can follow severe brain injury. Researchers now distinguish carefully between several conditions that were, for a long time, poorly differentiated from each other, often to devastating effect for patients and families. A coma is a state of complete unresponsiveness, with no sleep-wake cycle at all, typically not lasting more than a few weeks before evolving into another state. The eyes are closed. There is no response to pain, no response to voice, no sign of any awareness whatsoever. A vegetative state, now often called unresponsive wakefulness syndrome in more recent clinical terminology, involves the return of sleep-wake cycles, and the patient's eyes may open, but there is no evidence, on standard clinical examination, of any awareness of self or surroundings. The person appears awake, they open their eyes, they go through cycles of sleeping and waking, but they show no sign of responding to the world around them, no tracking of objects with their eyes, no response to commands, no evidence that anyone is home. A minimally conscious state involves clear but inconsistent evidence of awareness. A patient might, on some occasions, reliably track a moving object with their eyes or respond appropriately to a simple command, but not consistently enough to communicate reliably. One day, they might follow a ball with their gaze. The next day, nothing. One morning, they might squeeze your hand when you ask them to. That evening, no response at all. The flame of awareness flickers, comes and goes, present one moment and absent the next, for reasons that remain poorly understood. What makes this area of research genuinely difficult and genuinely important is that clinical bedside examination, simply observing a patient's behavior for signs of responsiveness, turns out to be a surprisingly unreliable way of detecting consciousness, particularly in patients whose motor systems are also severely damaged, who might be having rich conscious experience with no reliable way to behaviorally demonstrate it at all. Imagine being fully awake, fully aware, able to hear and understand everything happening around you, able to feel pain and fear and hope, and yet unable to move a single muscle, unable to speak a single word, unable to signal in any way that you are there, that you are still a person, still experiencing, still present. This condition, sometimes called locked-in syndrome, when it results from specific types of brainstem damage, is a genuine medical reality, and it means that the absence of behavioral signs of consciousness cannot be taken as proof of the absence of consciousness itself. A person who appears completely unresponsive from the outside might be fully awake on the inside, trapped in a body that no longer responds to their will. This led to one of the more remarkable applied results to come out of consciousness research, work led by neuroscientist Adrian Owen and colleagues beginning in the mid-2000s, using fMRI to ask patients diagnosed as vegetative, behaviorally unresponsive by every standard clinical measure, to imagine playing tennis, a task known to reliably activate a specific, recognizable pattern of motor-related brain activity in healthy people, versus imagining walking through their own home, a task that activates a different, equally recognizable spatial pattern. A meaningful proportion of patients who showed absolutely no outward behavioral sign of awareness nonetheless produced exactly the correct, differentiated brain activity in response to these two different instructions, reliably and repeatedly. They couldn't move. They couldn't speak. They couldn't signal with their eyes or their hands. But their brains responded exactly as a conscious person's brain would respond, following the instructions, imagining the actions, producing the distinct patterns of activity that correspond to each task. This provided strong evidence of covert consciousness, and even a crude but genuine channel of yes or no communication in patients who had, in some cases, been assumed by the people caring for them, for years, to have no inner life at all. They were there. They had been there all along. And until someone thought to look inside their brains while asking them to imagine playing tennis, there was simply no way for anyone to know. There's one more variation worth sitting with, because it complicates something you probably take completely for granted: the assumption that you have exactly one unified stream of consciousness, one single experiencer, running the show. This comes from a remarkable body of research on what are called split-brain patients, people who, usually as a last resort treatment for severe, otherwise untreatable epilepsy, underwent a surgical procedure severing the corpus callosum, the thick band of roughly 200 million nerve fibers that normally connects the brain's left and right hemispheres and allows them to share information constantly and rapidly. The corpus callosum is the great bridge between the two halves of the brain, the pathway through which the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere communicate, coordinating their activities, sharing their perceptions, merging their separate processing into a single unified experience. In a split-brain patient, that bridge has been cut. The two hemispheres can no longer talk to each other. They operate side by side, in the same skull, processing the same world, but no longer sharing what they process. Beginning in the 1960s, psychologist Roger Sperry and his student Michael Gazzaniga conducted a series of now classic experiments on these patients, exploiting the fact that, due to how the visual system is wired, information presented briefly to the left half of a person's visual field is sent exclusively to the right hemisphere, and information presented to the right half of the visual field is sent exclusively to the left hemisphere, and in a split-brain patient, unlike in an intact brain, that information can no longer cross over and be shared with the other side. What Sperry and Gazzaniga found was genuinely startling. If a picture of an object was flashed only to a split-brain patient's right hemisphere, the patient's left hand, which the right hemisphere controls, could correctly pick out that object by touch from a group of hidden objects, but the patient, when asked verbally what they had seen, would say they'd seen nothing at all, because in the vast majority of people, the brain's primary language centers sit in the left hemisphere, and the left hemisphere, cut off from the right, genuinely had no access to that information. The right hemisphere saw the object and guided the hand. The left hemisphere, the speaking hemisphere, saw nothing and reported nothing. Two streams of awareness, operating in parallel, one silent, one verbal, neither knowing what the other knew. Even stranger, when the two hemispheres were given conflicting instructions simultaneously, one famous case involved a patient whose left hemisphere was instructed, via written word visible only to it, to laugh, and the patient did laugh, and when asked why, the left hemisphere, the verbal half, confidently made up a plausible-sounding reason on the spot, unaware that the real instruction had come from the other side of the patient's own skull. This is not a person lying. This is a person genuinely believing the explanation they are giving, because the part of them that is speaking genuinely does not know the real cause of the behavior. Gazzaniga would later describe this confabulating tendency of the left hemisphere as evidence for something he called the interpreter, a specific cognitive system, seemingly concentrated in the left hemisphere, whose job is to construct a coherent, unified narrative explanation for the person's own behavior, filling in plausible reasons even when the true cause is entirely inaccessible to it. The interpreter is the part of you that makes sense of your own actions, that weaves them into a story, that explains to yourself and others why you did what you did, and it will do its job even when it doesn't have access to the real reasons, spinning a plausible tale out of whatever information it does have, and presenting that tale as the truth. This raises a genuinely uncomfortable possibility that extends well beyond split-brain patients specifically, the possibility that the vivid, confident sense every one of us has of knowing exactly why we did what we just did, of having direct, transparent access to the true causes of our own behavior, might itself be, at least partly, a well-constructed after-the-fact story, rather than an accurate real-time readout of the actual causal process. Split-brain research remains one of the most direct empirical demonstrations that the felt unity of consciousness, something integrated information theory treats as one of its core defining properties, is not an unbreakable, indivisible given, but is itself a product of specific physical connections. Connections that can, under the right and rather extreme circumstances, be surgically severed, leaving behind what genuinely looks, on careful testing, like two separate streams of awareness, operating within a single skull, largely unaware of each other. The unity we take for granted, the single I that seems so fundamental to who we are, turns out to depend, quite literally, on a small bridge of nerve fibers connecting the two halves of the brain. Cut that bridge, and the single I seems to become two, or at least something close enough to two that it forces us to reconsider what we mean by one in the first place. Altered states of consciousness produced by psychoactive substances offer yet another kind of natural variation, and one that has recently returned to serious scientific study after decades of being largely off-limits for research due to legal restrictions imposed in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Classic psychedelic compounds, including psilocybin and LSD, have been shown, using modern brain imaging, to produce a fairly specific and consistent signature of changes in brain activity, most notably a marked decrease in the organized activity of a network of brain regions called the default mode network, a set of interconnected areas, including regions of the medial prefrontal and posterior cingulate cortex, that are normally highly active when a person is not engaged in any particular external task, and that are strongly associated with self-referential thought, mind-wandering, and the maintenance of a stable, consistent sense of self over time. The default mode network is, in a sense, the neural home of the self. When you're not focused on anything in particular, when your mind is wandering, when you're thinking about yourself, your past, your future, your relationships, your place in the world, this network is active. It's the network that keeps the story of who you are running in the background, maintaining the continuity of your identity, the sense that you are the same person you were yesterday and will be the same person tomorrow. It's active when you're daydreaming, when you're reminiscing, when you're planning, when you're worrying. It's the neural correlate of the narrative self, the I, that has a history and a future, and a set of concerns that define who you take yourself to be. Under the influence of these compounds, activity within this network becomes markedly less organized, and connectivity across the whole brain becomes, by several measures, more globally integrated and less rigidly compartmentalized than in ordinary waking consciousness. A pattern researcher, Robin Carhart Harris, and colleagues have described using the phrase entropic brain, suggesting a state of increased neural randomness and flexibility compared to the more constrained, efficient, and predictable patterns of ordinary consciousness. The brain, normally organized into relatively distinct, specialized networks that communicate in predictable, well-worn pathways, becomes more fluid, more interconnected, less predictable. Regions that don't normally talk to each other begin to communicate. The usual boundaries between networks become more permeable. The brain enters a state that is, in some ways, closer to the rich, varied, unpredictable activity of infancy than to the efficient, streamlined, habitual activity of a typical adult mind. Subjectively, this altered pattern of brain activity is frequently associated with a marked, often dramatic weakening of the ordinary felt boundary between self and world, sometimes described by people who have had the experience as a dissolution of the ego, alongside vivid changes in sensory perception. The sense of being a separate self, a distinct individual looking out at a world that is separate and other, can give way to a feeling of unity, of merging, of being not a self in a world, but a seamless part of a larger whole. The boundaries that normally define your experience, the boundary between your body and the air around it, between your thoughts and the sounds you hear, between past and present and future, can soften or dissolve entirely. Colors can become more vivid. Sounds can take on new depth and meaning. Familiar objects can seem unfamiliar, and unfamiliar objects can seem deeply significant. Time can slow down, or speed up, or lose its ordinary structure altogether. This body of research is scientifically valuable for consciousness studies specifically because it offers yet another natural manipulation alongside sleep stages and split brain surgery that can shift the specific mechanisms discussed earlier: network integration, default mode activity, predictive processing, in a controlled, measurable direction, and then correlate that shift with a very clear, often dramatically reported change in subjective experience, adding one more data point to the accumulating picture of which physical changes track which changes in the felt quality of a mind. When you turn down the default mode network, the self seems to loosen. When you increase global connectivity, the boundaries between things seem to soften. When you increase neural entropy, the world seems to become richer, more meaningful, more intense. These are correlations, not yet explanations, but they are powerful clues, pointing toward the physical underpinnings of some of the most basic features of ordinary experience: the sense of self, the sense of separateness, the sense of a world that is real and solid and other than you. It's worth pausing now to bring all of this back down to the ground, because everything discussed so far isn't confined to a laboratory somewhere. It's operating in the room you're lying in right now, and in some of the objects around you, in ways that are worth understanding directly. The theories, the experiments, the brain scans, the philosophical debates, all of them are about the very thing that is happening to you, right now, as you lie in the dark, listening to these words. The global workspace is, or is not, broadcasting the sound of this voice across your cortex. The integrated information is, or is not, binding the fragments of your experience into a unified whole. The higher-order representations are, or are not, monitoring the fact that you are hearing, feeling, thinking. The predictions are flowing, the errors are being corrected, the spotlight of attention is shifting, and all of it is happening without you having to lift a finger. You are being assembled, moment by moment, by processes you did not choose and cannot directly observe, and yet the result is the most intimate, the most familiar, the most unquestionably real thing in your entire existence, the simple fact that you are here, experiencing this, now. Start with the most obvious application, one that touches almost everyone at some point in their life: general anesthesia. Every year, tens of millions of people around the world are deliberately, temporarily, and reversibly rendered unconscious, on purpose, by trained professionals, using drugs whose precise mechanism, for a surprisingly long time, was not well understood, even as they were being used safely and routinely. For more than a century after the first public demonstration of surgical anesthesia in 1846, anesthesiologists knew that certain drugs reliably produced unconsciousness, but they didn't know exactly why, or exactly how to measure whether a given patient was truly unconscious or merely unable to move and form memories. They dosed based on weight and experience and watched for signs of movement or changes in heart rate, indirect measures at best, and in rare cases, terrifyingly, patients would wake up during surgery, aware but paralyzed, unable to signal for help. Modern anesthesiology has become a direct, practical application of exactly the theories discussed earlier tonight. Anesthesiologists now commonly monitor something called the bispectral index, a number derived from a patient's ongoing EEG signal during surgery, specifically designed to track the kind of large-scale cortical synchronization associated with unconsciousness, giving the surgical team a real-time, moment-to-moment readout that helps them keep a patient reliably unconscious throughout a procedure, adjusting drug dosage up or down as needed, rather than relying purely on fixed dosing schedules or a patient's outward stillness, which can be unreliable, particularly in combination with the paralytic drugs also commonly used during major surgery, drugs that block muscle movement independently of consciousness itself. The patient might be completely still, but not because they're unconscious. They might be awake, aware, feeling everything, but simply unable to move a single muscle to let anyone know. The bispectral index and related EEG-based monitors provide a window into the brain's electrical activity that bypasses the paralysis, giving the surgical team a way to estimate whether the patient is truly unconscious or merely immobilized. This is consciousness science, saving lives, quietly, every day, in operating rooms around the world. Researchers, including Giulio Tononi's own group, have specifically studied anesthetic drug action through the lens of integrated information, finding that different anesthetic agents, despite working through quite different molecular mechanisms in the brain, some acting on one class of receptor, some acting on entirely different ones, tend to converge on a broadly similar functional effect at the level of large-scale brain activity. A marked reduction in the complexity and integration of activity moving between the frontal and posterior regions of the cortex. Different keys, different locks, but the same door closing. The specific molecular mechanism doesn't seem to matter, as long as the result is a breakdown in the kind of rich, integrated long-range communication that both global workspace theory and integrated information theory identify as essential for consciousness. This finding lines up well with the general predictions both major theories would make about what unconsciousness should look like, regardless of exactly which molecular door the drug happens to walk through to get there. The device sitting somewhere in your room right now, your phone, connects to this subject in a very different but increasingly urgent way. Over the past several years, extraordinarily capable artificial intelligence systems have been built, trained on vast amounts of human-generated text and other data, capable of holding fluent, contextually appropriate conversations, capable of producing responses that, on the page, can be genuinely difficult to distinguish from something a thoughtful person might write. This has revived, with real practical urgency, a question that used to feel comfortably theoretical: whether a sufficiently sophisticated information processing system, built from silicon rather than neurons, could have any form of genuine inner experience at all, rather than being, however impressively, a system that processes and produces language without anyone being home to experience the processing. The major theories discussed tonight actually give meaningfully different answers to this question, which is itself revealing. Global workspace theory, focused primarily on the functional pattern of information being broadcast widely and made available across a system, is, in its more permissive interpretations, relatively open to the idea that an artificial system with the right kind of broad, integrative architecture might in principle satisfy the theory's criteria for consciousness, regardless of whether it's built from neurons or silicon. If the system has a global workspace, a stage where information is broadcast and made widely available, then it might, on this view, have consciousness, or at least something functionally equivalent to consciousness, regardless of what physical materials implement that workspace. Integrated information theory tends to push in a notably more skeptical direction for most current artificial intelligence systems specifically, because, as discussed earlier, the theory cares intensely about the specific physical architecture generating the information processing, not just the software or the behavioral output, and most current AI systems run on computer hardware, built around highly centralized processing units, that is architecturally quite different from the massively, richly interconnected structure of a biological brain, meaning that even a system producing remarkably human-like output could, on this theory's own terms, be generating very little integrated information, and therefore very little or no consciousness, behind that output, no matter how convincing the output looks from the outside. This isn't a settled question, and serious researchers on multiple sides of it disagree genuinely and substantively, but it's a direct, live, practical illustration of exactly why the theoretical differences discussed earlier in the night aren't merely academic. They lead to different real answers about a question more and more people are now asking directly, about systems more and more people now talk to every day. When you ask your phone a question and it answers in a voice that sounds thoughtful or curious or even uncertain, you are interacting with a system that, depending on which theory of consciousness turns out to be correct, is either a sophisticated but unconscious information processor or a system with at least the potential for some form of genuine inner experience, or something that might become conscious if its architecture were changed in particular ways. And right now, we genuinely don't know which of those is true. We are building minds, or at least the outward behavior of minds, at an extraordinary pace, and we are doing so without any consensus on whether we are also building the inward experience that normally accompanies that behavior in the only conscious systems we know for sure. This is one of the most important unanswered questions of our time, and it rests directly on the same theoretical disagreements we've been exploring tonight. Look upward, too, if you can, or just picture the sky above the room you're in right now, because even that connects to tonight's subject, through one of the more sobering applications of consciousness science, the study of animal minds. For a very long time, particularly under the influence of the strict behaviorist tradition discussed earlier, serious scientific caution, sometimes tipping into outright denial, was the default professional stance toward the idea that non-human animals have genuine subjective experience at all. Some researchers, echoing a much older tradition going back to Descartes himself, who considered animals to be essentially unconscious biological machines, argued that attributing feelings to animals was an unscientific projection of human qualities onto creatures that couldn't actually have them. The animal might cry out when injured, but that was just a mechanical reflex, like the squeal of a rusty hinge. It might seem to show joy when its owner returned, but that was just a conditioned response, a set of behaviors shaped by reinforcement, with no inner feeling behind them. The animal was a machine, a very complex machine, but a machine nonetheless, doing what machines do, processing inputs and producing outputs, with the lights completely off inside. This position has shifted substantially over the past few decades, driven significantly by exactly the neural correlate research discussed earlier tonight, because many of the specific brain structures now most strongly associated with consciousness in humans, thalamocortical circuits, midbrain arousal structures, are either directly shared with or have clear structural and functional analogues in a very wide range of other vertebrate species. The same deep brainstem structures that keep you awake and aware keep a dog awake and aware. The same thalamocortical loops that seem to support conscious experience in your brain are present, in slightly different forms, in the brains of cats, of mice, of birds. The basic machinery of consciousness, the neural architecture that seems to make experience possible, is not uniquely human. It is part of an ancient, shared biological inheritance, stretching back through millions of years of evolution, long before anything resembling a human being walked the earth. This body of evidence culminated in a public declaration with real practical significance, the 2012 Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness, signed by a prominent group of neuroscientists at a conference at the University of Cambridge, which stated explicitly that the weight of scientific evidence indicates that a wide range of non-human animals, including all mammals and birds, and many other creatures as well, possess the neurological substrates that generate consciousness, and that humans are not unique in this regard. The declaration was not a sentimental statement. It was not an expression of personal feeling or ethical preference. It was a carefully worded, evidence-based conclusion, signed by some of the most respected researchers in the field, stating clearly that the scientific case for animal consciousness had reached a threshold that could no longer be responsibly ignored. The inner light, the felt experience of being something rather than nothing, was not a human invention. It was a biological phenomenon, present in many different kinds of creatures, with many different kinds of minds, experiencing many different kinds of worlds. More recently still, similar reasoning has been extended even further than most people would intuitively expect, with a 2024 update called the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness, signed by several hundred researchers, explicitly stating that there is at least a realistic possibility of conscious experience in animals as evolutionarily distant from humans as octopuses, and even in some insects, given growing evidence of surprisingly sophisticated nervous system integration and flexible, seemingly deliberate behavior in creatures whose brains are structured extremely differently from vertebrate brains, having evolved the relevant complexity independently rather than inheriting it from a shared conscious ancestor. An octopus has a brain that is radically different from a human brain, with a completely different evolutionary history, a completely different architecture, neurons distributed throughout its arms as well as concentrated in a central ganglion, a kind of distributed intelligence that we are only beginning to understand. And yet octopuses solve problems, recognize individual humans, show signs of curiosity and play, and behave in ways that are difficult to explain without attributing some form of inner experience to them. If consciousness can arise in a brain so different from our own, then the phenomenon may be far more widespread, far more varied, far more deeply woven into the fabric of the living world than we once assumed. This has direct, immediate practical consequences that extend well beyond the laboratory, shaping ongoing ethical and legal debates about the treatment of animals in research, in agriculture, and in the wild. Because how you answer the theoretical question of which physical systems generate consciousness turns out to directly determine which creatures you believe are actually capable of suffering, and therefore which creature's treatment carries direct moral weight, rather than being, as it was long assumed to be for many species, a matter of no moral consequence at all. If a fish is merely a biological machine, processing information without any inner experience, then the question of how we treat fish is purely a practical one, a matter of sustainability and resource management, with no ethical dimension beyond that. But if a fish feels pain, if there is something it is like to be a fish, and that something includes the raw, unpleasant quality of suffering, then the moral calculus changes. The same applies to the octopus, to the lobster, to the insect. The further we extend the circle of consciousness, the further we extend the circle of moral consideration. The science, incomplete as it is beginning to suggest that the circle may be very wide indeed. And then there's the room you're actually in right now, tonight, which connects to this subject in the most immediate way of all, because the walls around you, the ceiling above you, the specific arrangement of your body against whatever you're resting on, are themselves being continuously, actively, and mostly unconsciously modeled by the same predictive processing machinery discussed earlier. Your brain maintains a constantly updated internal model of the layout of the room, allowing you to reach for a glass of water in near darkness without consciously recalculating its location from scratch, updating that model slightly every time you shift position, using a combination of vision, memory, and the sense of your own body's position in space, called proprioception, all integrated together, mostly outside conscious awareness, so that only the parts that matter, an unexpected obstacle, a change in temperature, rise to the level of something you actually notice. The room, as you experience it, is not a direct perception of a physical space. It is a construction, a very good one, updated moment by moment, but a construction nonetheless, built by your brain out of memory and expectation and a thin stream of sensory data, and presented to you as a world, simply there, to be inhabited. Even your sense of where your body ends and the world begins, which feels so obvious and stable that you'd probably never think to question it, is itself an actively maintained construction, not a simple given fact, something demonstrated with striking clarity by an experiment called the rubber hand illusion, first described by researchers Matthew Botvinnik and Jonathan Cohen in 1998. In this experiment, a person watches a realistic rubber hand being stroked with a small brush, in careful synchrony with their own actual, hidden hand being stroked at the same time in the same pattern. After a short period of this synchronized stroking, a striking proportion of people report a genuine, often quite strong feeling that the rubber hand has become their own hand, sometimes even flinching or showing a measurable stress response if the rubber hand is then suddenly struck or threatened. The brain, faced with two streams of information, the sight of a hand being stroked and the feeling of a hand being stroked, and finding those streams perfectly synchronized, draws the simplest conclusion: this must be my hand. The fact that the hand is obviously rubber, obviously not part of the body, doesn't matter. The deeper, older, more automatic systems that determine where the self ends and the world begins have been fooled, and the felt boundary shifts to include something that was, moments before, clearly not part of you. This is a vivid demonstration that even something as apparently basic and fixed as your felt sense of which body parts belong to you is being actively, continuously constructed by your brain from moment to moment, based on the available sensory evidence, rather than being simply, passively given, once and for all, at birth. There's one more everyday application worth mentioning before we move to the harder questions, because it touches something you interact with constantly without ever thinking about it this way, and that's screens themselves. The phone on your nightstand, the television across the room, the tablet you might have used earlier tonight. Every one of these devices exploits a specific, well-understood limitation of your visual system, a limitation directly tied to how consciousness constructs a continuous experience out of discrete input. A film or video is not actually continuous motion. It's a rapid sequence of still images, typically shown somewhere between 24 and 60 times per second, and your visual system, rather than perceiving this as a series of separate flashes, integrates them into what feels like smooth, unbroken movement, a phenomenon related to what researchers call the persistence of vision, though the fuller modern explanation involves the same predictive processing machinery discussed earlier, your brain expecting continuity and smoothing rapid discrete samples into a seamless, predicted whole, rather than faithfully reporting every gap. The gaps are there. The screen is dark for a significant fraction of every second, but you don't see the darkness. You see the movement, because your brain fills in what it expects to be there, and what it expects to be there is continuity. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it's a small, concrete, easily demonstrated example of a much larger and more important truth, that a great deal of what your consciousness presents to you as smooth, continuous, and complete is, at the level of actual raw input, considerably more fragmented, sampled, and gap-filled than it feels like it is, and that this feeling of seamlessness is itself an achievement of your brain's construction process, not a simple, direct transcription of an already seamless world flowing in from outside. The world you experience is not the world as it is. It is the world as your brain constructs it, filling gaps, smoothing edges, predicting what should be there, and then experiencing the prediction as though it were a perception. This is not a flaw, it's a feature. It's what allows you to navigate a complex, changing environment with speed and flexibility. But it's worth remembering, especially on a night like tonight, when the boundaries between waking and sleeping begin to blur, that what feels most solid and most real is, in a very literal sense, a kind of dream, a carefully constrained, continuously corrected, but ultimately constructed dream, built by the same machinery that will, in a little while, build you a different kind of world entirely, one with its own logic, its own geography, its own cast of characters, and one that, while you're inside it, will feel just as real as this one does now.